Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. This evening I'm going to be looking into one of the overlooked causes of the French Revolution, the quiet demise of the most Christian king. This represents, or what I will try and uncover, is a royal existential crisis of the 18th century. Indeed, this was a crisis that the restoration of the monarchy following the French Revolution would fail to resolve. The monarchy of Louis XIV, the great 17th century monarch, known in some quarters in France as Louis le Grand, Louis the Great, can be distilled into this. The king is France, and to be French is to be Catholic. When we look at the process of dechristianization in France during the Revolution, we tend to associate it with its most radical and violent form, the destruction of churches, the killing of priests, and the attempt to establish religions in opposition to Catholicism, religions of reason, and other forms of deism like the cult of the supreme being. This is a process that doesn't really resolve back into the favor of Catholic Christianity until the Napoleonic Concordat of 1801. So against the radical dechristianizing tendency of the French Revolution, this evening I'm going to be focusing on the subtle aspect of dechristianization, the devolution of Catholicism in France from an interior spiritual zeal to that of an exterior faith, a faith which is merely the practice of forms rather than spiritual substance. You can refer to this as the emptying of the spiritual substance within France. And nothing perhaps demonstrates this quite as well as Louis XVI's defense at his trial before the National Convention shortly before he was executed in 1793, because there were no assertions of sacred monarchy or divine right. These had been abandoned. Indeed, you can say that they've been consigned merely to that of past pretensions. Instead, now the king was defending his life and indeed the legacy of his reign by right of the people, the French Constitution, and liberty. Since the reign of Saint Louis, Louis IX, in the 13th century, the style of most Christian king, or Rex Christianissimus, became intimately associated with the monarchy in France all the way up until the reign of Louis XVI. Indeed, it became an established norm in all the royal etiquette and styles deferred to the monarchy in the 14th century, you can say as an attempt to remedy a legitimacy crisis during the 100 Years' War. So dechristianizing the most Christian king in France, which is often referred to as the eldest daughter of the church, occupying a place of first among equals, primus inter pares of the national churches of Catholicism, it turns into a broader crisis of the church, indeed a European crisis, as the French Revolution will so violently demonstrate. In order to really begin to understand how the most Christian king can be dechristianized, we need to see Catholic politics as distinct from that of the absolute monarchy. And this is where I'm going to present the first of a few paradoxes for absolutism in France, the Louis XIV distillation that I mentioned earlier. The first is the Gallican paradox, whereby the French monarchy pursued the interests of the French nation or the reason of the state aggressively in all of her wars, really since the reign of Francis I, going all the way up until the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, 200 years of waging violent warfare against other major Catholic powers. The Gallican paradox essentially enabled the monarchy in France, despite being Catholic, to wage war on other Catholic nations. Indeed, when we look at Gallicanism, the tragedy for the monarchy is that the monarchy would fall, but Gallicanism will survive in France. Gallicanism underpins, you can say, the modern reality, which is Gaullism, but for Gaullism, Gallicanism became grandeur of the French nation. Moving on from the Gallican paradox, I want to focus on the sacramental paradox, where we look at such things like the royal touch, the assumption among the population of France that the king could actually heal the sick, in particular Scrofula, and how such aspects of the sacraments associated with the monarchy began to be ridiculed and fall into abeyance during the reign of Louis XV. In other words, throughout all of French society, we see an aspect of the sacraments devolving into a form of outward conformity. If to be French again is to be Catholic, it actually confirms a point of religious apathy towards the sacraments. And then there is the absolute monarchy personal paradox, which is exhibited by the figure of Louis XV. I have been referencing many haughty, you can almost say, superhuman aspects of kingship in France. Indeed, if anyone watched my talk on Kantorowicz, his view on monarchy is that monarchy can only really be best served by the optimal man, that which almost transcends all human vices and acts as some sort of exemplar for the human race. So how do you couple this fact with someone who is thoroughly debauched and basically given over to the sin of lust? That is the paradox represented by Louis XV. Indeed, you can really look at the reign of Louis XV, especially the later reign of Louis XV, as similar to that of what we see as the pornocracy in papal history. To paraphrase how Frederick II, the Great of Prussia, would look at the French monarchy, we can look at it as petticoatocracy, in other words, the rule of the official mistress, in particular one Madame de Pompadour. And combined to this, we have something called Baroque religiosity. One possible reading of Baroque beyond its artistic expression, which is that of a very grandiose post-Tridentine Reformed Catholicism, is somewhat, again, obscure, labyrinthine. You can say there's some analog in using Baroque as an adjective to actually refer to Byzantine. In other words, it's a religiosity which is all full of pomp, ceremony, grandeur, again, to come back to that Gaullist term, but it sincerely represents something which is part of an elite clique, and there's no fundamental religious sentiment behind it. Such were the accusations that were labelled at the absolute monarch of the time, Louis XV, how such contradictions could be reconciled to the monarchy of the 18th century. Indeed, I've often asked the question, how could the monarchy of France have avoided this and sustained its future? If you look to figures like Voltaire, the consummate critic of the Catholic Church and superstition more broadly, he was always, really to the last, a defender, if not a blind sycophant towards monarchy, simply not the monarchy in France. So could the monarchy have transitioned into something else to stave off the ignominious and horrific future that will encounter at the hands of the French revolutionaries? In other words, in the absence of a sacred monarchy, could we have a religion, a regime of tolerance? So, say, for example, looking to the examples of Frederick II to Emperor Joseph in Austria, what this has been termed as is enlightened despotism, everything for the people, nothing by the people. Looking at the Hobbesian Leviathan, the state is absolute, but the state is there to maintain peace above all else rather than this religious conformity. Indeed, there is a precedent for something in France, which is that of Henry IV, one of the most popular kings of France, who was a Protestant who converted to Catholicism in 1594 in order that he be welcomed into the city of Paris. But France did not turn into an absolute monarchy, into enlightened despotism. And so that path was essentially closed. And I'll mention a cruel irony as to why that is the case. When you view the dechristianization, the subtle dechristianization of the French monarchy in terms of other factors, the reason I'm placing so much emphasis on it is if you look at economic factors, well, elsewhere in French history, you can look at a series of bad harvests and attest great upheavals to it. One such would be the Jacquerie in the 1360s, which caused a major crisis for the Dauphin, who would later be Charles V of France, but the monarchy was able to survive. If you look at the class struggle, there is a broader aspect of the class struggle, which is so endemic in terms of analysis of the French Revolution, but you can see that much of the recapture of the offices and the privileges by the nobility at the expense of, say, for example, the more bourgeoisie ministers of Louis XIV, even Philip IV going back before, is a comparatively more perennial affair compared to the emptying of the monarchy of its spiritual substance. Indeed, if you read Reinhard Koselleck, he views much of the criticism directed at the monarchy in a almost Manichaean aspect of it. In other words, there is a true knowledge, a gnosis, which is represented by the return to nature, to use Rousseau's terminology, and the monarchy represents a demiurge, that which is withholding true reality. In other words, not just the monarchy becomes associated with this false reality, but so does the church, because both have become virtually inseparable in the minds of the revolutionaries. And again, I'll get into that. But more or less, this will ensure that as Catholicism, in theory, was able to stamp out all counter-religious sentiment, we have a anti-Christian opposition, a violent anti-Christian opposition within a nominally uniformly Catholic country, all the way up until 1788 on the eve of the French Revolution. And to really underline this, I'm going to be reading a segment from Van Kley, The Religious Origins of the French Revolution. This book, for reference, is going to be the main source for this evening. And I would recommend you all go out and purchase it, especially if you're not necessarily aware of these revisionist takes when it comes to the history of the French Revolution. To be French was to be Catholic until the very eve of the Revolution. The Catholic sacrament of baptism functioned as a certificate of citizenship for native-born Frenchmen, while acceptance of Catholicism was a prerequisite for the naturalization of foreigners. For all of France's 27 million subjects, this being in 1789, and throughout the length of the pre-revolutionary 18th century, the Catholic calendar and church bells continued to order time, and churches and other edifices dominated space, as measured by such indexes as the provision for requiem masses or sacred burial, and the invocations to Christ in the last wills and testaments. Baroque Catholic observance perhaps peaked in France in the first third of the 18th century and held its own for a while thereafter. What he's referring to there is the earlier reign of Louis XV, just after the reign of Louis XIV. This identity of France and Catholicity was hardly compromised by the existence of 40 or 50,000 Jews who wait until the revolution for citizenship, or by 500,000 Calvinists or Huguenots who obtained a minimal civil status in 1788. That's the date I was referring to earlier, after 100 years of official non-existence. Nor, for that matter, was it aggressively challenged by the philosophes, i.e. the Enlightenment writers and invariably critics of the monarchy and indeed the Catholic Church, most of whom found it impossible to imagine a France formally separated from the Church. On the contrary, these philosophes underwent baptism in the Church. The few who married solemnized their marriages as a Catholic sacrament, and most ended their days receiving the last rites of the Catholic faith. If you look at figures like the Abbé de Talleyrand and the Abbé Sears, and reading this and understanding this, how France was basically a land of Catholic uniform convention, it shouldn't surprise you that so many of these figures who are actually part bishops in the religious establishment should instead choose to become acolytes of the new revolutionary creed. Indeed, many of them go along with it and become fully, I wouldn't necessarily fully converted to the ideas of dechristianization, but there's nevertheless a complicity that exists there. Of any tensions between secular lights and the basic tenets of the Christian faith, many Catholics joined Masonic lodges in the pre-revolutionary decades and did not think of Catholicism and Freemasonry as incompatible. Even philosophes remained more Christian and even more Catholic than they knew they were. One such case is actually Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobite cause, of course, being very much seen as an extension of the foreign policy goals of the French monarchy, especially in 1745. But we have figures such as Bonnie Prince Charlie. We also have figures such as the Duc d'Orléans, one of the most powerful nobles in France, and indeed a man once seen in the earlier phases of the French Revolution as leading an attempt to depose the king himself. So the idea of Freemasonry and Catholicism was endemic, despite the fact that in the decades since, and indeed in the centuries thereafter, the Catholic Church has maintained, at least on paper, the notion that Freemasonry and Catholicism are completely incompatible. But the idea that there were so many Freemasons who practiced the outward beliefs and sacraments of Catholicism, again, should, if anything, underline this fact that towards the end of the 18th century, religion in France was becoming ever more nominal. In 1762, education remained an almost exclusively clerical affair in Old France, from the Sorbonne in Paris, which was the main ecclesiastical educational structure, to the humblest priestly tutor in the countryside. Despite the steady growth of royal administration in the 18th century, the parish priest and his Sunday homily retained the monarchy's only reliable mouthpiece for communicating with all of its 27 million subjects, and whatever the ups and downs of the Gallican Church's doings with the Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century, Catholicism continued to give the monarchy its identity to the very end. The idea of the pulpit, again, being an instrument, you can say again cynically, and not just an instrument of news and royal edicts, but also an instrument of propaganda. All of this is leading to my conclusion at the end as to why the usage of the term throne and altar becomes such a pejorative. And when it is used, it tends to be describing a very particular instance of Catholic monarchy. And I'm going to ascribe it to the few decades from the 1760s up until the 1780s, just before the French Revolution, do I believe that term has any significance or merit. What is clearly different about the France of the 18th century is the presence of an Enlightenment sufficiently anti-Catholic, indeed anti-Christian in tone, so as to make for a third force, in contrast to the gradual shading of the cause of light into that of religious dissent elsewhere in Europe. The cause of light being the cause of the Enlightenment, of course. But the fact is, elsewhere in Europe over the last few centuries, so we're talking since the Protestant Reformation in 1517, especially in the case of England, the civil wars in England were in many ways a religious civil war, not just between hardline Protestants and the perception of crypto-Catholics, but Protestants who were in some ways proto-communists and apocalyptic sort of anticipators, as opposed to the monarchy and its emphasis on the church, the hierarchy, the episcopacy, in other words, the structure of bishops. If we look and understand the history of the 17th century in England, in many ways is the playing out of religious conflict. And indeed, we see that religious conflict carry over into the 18th century with the Hanoverian kings and indeed the Jacobite wars. Elsewhere in Europe, much of the religious turmoil has actually been generated into, as I mentioned, the understanding of a regime of tolerance whereby the king and the state stand supreme above religion, as is the case with Frederick II, who, again, the jury's out as to his specific nature of his religious beliefs, but there is a large opinion which is pervaded that he was indeed an atheist. With all of that understood, we need to come to the significance of the French monarchy itself and the idea of the Rex Christianissimus, the most sacred king, and why the fall, or at least you can say the emptying of the spiritual substance of the most Christian king, would be so disastrous for the future of France. In France, the monarchy was itself an object of something like religious veneration, the sacramental center of the religion royale. Because this royal religion did not exactly coincide and at best overlapped with the Catholicism that at times during the investiture conflict, this early sort of Holy Roman Empire imperial history, again, to try and make this as simply as possible, the conflict between the Pope and the Emperor over the appointment of bishops, for example, had challenged it in essential ways. The monarchy's religious preferences were perforce dictated by reason of their compatibility or incompatibility with its own cultic identity. The roots of this royal religion lay deep in the pagan past. On the Germanic side, in the notion of the kingly family descended from Wodan, from which kings had to be chosen, and on the classical side, in the gradual divinization of the emperors during late Roman antiquity. This is a very important point to note because elsewhere in this channel, I've argued looking at pagan monarchs like Alexander as anticipating not just Roman monarchy, but Byzantine Grecophone monarchy in particular. And it should also be noted that when looking at the monarchy of Constantine really going forward in the 4th century and the whole notion of Christian kingship, right on the cusp of the empire becoming Christian, there was the greatest assertion of its pagan identity when Diocletian declared himself not just Lord, but also a god, a pagan god in his own right. So the pagan god edifice of the monarchy was instead translated into a model for Christian kingship. In the case of France, we have the Roman legacy and we have the Frankish legacy combined in the form of the French king. Early Frankish kings deftly exploited both traditions, being at once Germanic chieftains and the agents of declining imperial authority. The conversion of Clovis around 500 did not so much as displace as Christianize these traditions, a process that culminated when Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps to legitimate Pepin the Short's seizure of the Frankish kingship by anointing him king in 754. What it means by displace again, it's not that we're talking about a pagan Christian fusion of monarchy, but we really are talking about the pagan form and a Christian essence being applied to it. Because the precedent Stephen invoked was the anointing of the first Old Testament kings by the prophet Samuel, anointing of Pepin transformed him and his successors into the Lord's anointed, the successors of King David and Solomon, and through the same line into the successors of Christ as well. The Christ, at its most basic level, is simply the anointed one, and so the Lord's anointed is to follow in the tradition of Christ-like kingship, and equating figures like Germanic kingship, Roman imperial status, and the monarchy of the early sort of Israelite kings is to codify and cement all of these traditions into a new monarchical tradition for France. If you read Bossuet's Politics Drawn from the Pages of Scripture, this will come through very evidently. And it should be mentioned that de Bossuet is the greatest sort of theological exponent of absolute monarchy in France, for better or worse. Charlemagne may or may not have thought himself as Christ-like or as a partly divine person, a gemina persona, but he most certainly acted in the role of agent or vicar of Christ and effective head of Christendom, convening and presiding over local church councils, taking a hand in the formulation of Christian doctrine, and forcibly converting Arian Germans and pagan Saxons to Nicene orthodoxy. What is meant by gemina persona is the two heads, one which is divine and one which is human. And as we're going to see, that's actually an attempt to create a imitation of Christ, the union in one body of one spiritual body and one physical body, one that is God and one that is man. In terms of the Arian Germans, that was a form of, I'm not necessarily going to call it Unitarian Christianity, but it was certainly it was a Christianity which de-emphasized the role of Christ vis-a-vis the role of God, and was the dominant role, the dominant force for Germanic Gothic Christianity in particular throughout the 6th century. And of course, Charlemagne is known for conquering the pagan Saxons and expounding the boundaries of Frankish civilization and indeed what later turned to be German civilization up to the river Elbe. The title of Roman Emperor received for his benefit by Pope Leo III in 800 continued a confusion between classical and Christian, as well as Germanic precedents. You can look at this as a confusion, or you can look at this as a successful harmonization of one or the other. By confusion, we're going to get into all of the arguments you can make from a Christian point of view, which attack this notion of monarchy from certain specific angles. Count Hugh Capet's usurpation of the Western kingship in 987 dealt a coup de grace to Carolingian legitimacy, therefore to any possibility of imperial pretensions in France, while the Gregorian reform movement of the 11th and 12th centuries vested the quality of Vicar of Christ once and for all in the papacy. What that's referencing is that in 987 there were three partitions of the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne: Middle Francia, East Francia, and West Francia. Middle Francia and East Francia were ultimately able to recoalesce as an empire, which is essentially where we get the nomenclature of the Holy Roman Empire from, as distinct from the Carolingian Empire. But Hugh Capet's quote-unquote usurpation or election is seen as not just the beginning of modern France, royal France, but the beginning of the French dynasty, the Capetians, who will carry on onwards until really the deposition of Louis Philippe in the year 1848. So the ascent of Hugh Capet is one of those significant events which really sort of distinguishes France from the rest of Europe, hence why West Francia simply becomes France. But Robert II, the pious, Capet successor as King of France, compensated for these losses by a miraculous curing of the sick, a power which his Capetian successors honed to the disease of Scrofula and attributed to the episcopal anointing or consecration that since the late 9th century had come to accompany the coronation ceremony. In other words, there had been an attack on secular rulers from the papacy to assert the primacy of the Pope above all Christian monarchs in Europe, even the emperor. And one of these aspects was to take on the position of Vicar of Christ, which by extension meant that the Pope could, in theory, remove, excommunicate any monarch at will. And many popes during the height of the Reformed papacy, quote unquote, in the 12th and the 13th century, used this prerogative. But nevertheless, what Van Kley is essentially asserting is that we see, you can again look at this rather cynically, the Christian kings are beginning to assert a sacramental identity, a supernatural identity, which would actually afford them, again, a spiritual force which is not entirely dependent on that of the Pope. In other words, there is a direct link between God, the supernatural, and the monarchy, which is affording the monarchs of France the right to lay hands and to cure the sick. Again, what is this supposed to imitate? It's supposed to imitate the anointed one. It is the healing hands of Christ which are being bestowed through what you can basically see as a priestly body in the form of a king who is now a ruler, and he is also a cleric. And the fact that this is again taking place in the coronation ceremony is to indicate that the coronation is kind of like a mass. While Germanic emperors staked their sacred position in spectacular confrontations with the papacy, Louis VI and VII less obtrusively enhanced theirs in cooperation with Rome, putting themselves at the head of a hitherto papal and episcopal peace movement, both in France and on crusade. At the prompting of Abbé Suger, the Abbé of Saint-Denis near Paris, kings effected a virtual identification between the Capetian kingship and the memory of relics and of saints and missionary and martyr de Gaulle. This raw relation to the peace movement also came to occupy a prominent place in the consecration and coronation ceremony, swearing as the king did to preserve the true peace of the Church of God. That ceremony, meanwhile, assumed the aspect of an elaborate liturgical rite, tantamount to an eighth sacrament, a hybrid of baptism and ordination that made its royal recipient an exterior bishop as well as a king, hence able, like priests, to take communion in both forms. Again, this is going to be confusing for many people who aren't Catholic, but again, traditionally in Mass, and this was actually a point of major sort of religious dispute around this time with the quote-unquote ultraquists in Bohemia, the priest takes communion with the bread and wine, and the lay parishioners will take priest in the single kind, which is the taking of the bread, the communion wafer. So again, it's to associate the king as being effectively akin to that of a priest, which is to demonstrate the hierarchy of the church. Indeed, this whole idea of the ceremony of coronation being an eighth sacrament is something that's been debated ad nauseum, not just in Catholic sort of circles, but in Protestant and indeed Orthodox circles as well. And there's never been a satisfying resolution as to what specific place the coronation ritual holds. But I think it's fair to at least interrogate the notion that it forms an aspect of an eighth sacrament, or if not that, again, alluding to the other sacraments. The sanctity of the king extended by decrees, extended by various degrees to the kingdom. The myth that the oil used to baptize Clovis had been sent by St. Remigius by the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove that has survived in the safekeeping of the Abbé Saint-Remy, spread from its origins in Reims to Paris under royal sponsorship in the 13th century, and became a central motif in what one historian has called the 13th century reconvening of the kinship. The use of this oil for the royal consecration not only suggested that the kings were secular successors of Christ, but featured their subjects in the role of a chosen people, singled out by God for special attention. The myth that the Capetian arms, the fleur-de-lis, had been given by an angel to Clovis's wife on the eve of his consecration as a sign of God's special care for France was attached itself to the monarchy in the 13th century, as did the myth of the divine origin of the Abbey of Saint-Denis' red and yellow silk banner, or the oriflamme, one of the first banners of France. At a more learned level, jurists too made their contribution at the same time, transferring the notion of the church as a mystical body to the French realm, as a body which is a mystical republic, or the mystical body of the republic, and casting the king as the head of the body politic in a way, again, analogous to Christ. Enough sanctity had accumulated in France by the 13th century, this during the time of Saint Louis, Louis IX, the great crusading king. His father, also it should be mentioned, King Charles had also gone on crusade, and Philip Auguste had been one of the great warring monarchs of the medieval era. He had essentially transcended what you could say on the spiritual plane his predecessor Louis VII had done, to conquer huge territories which up until then had been held by the Plantagenet monarchy. Enough sanctity had accumulated in France by the 13th century for a pope to concede that France was a holy kingdom, and for a French cleric to declare, even against the papacy, that he who carries on a war against the King of France works against the whole church, against the Catholic doctrine, against holiness and justice, and against the Holy Land. And as I've explored at length in my various other streams, especially my recent streams regarding the dissolution of the Templars and the Avignon papacy, the French monarchy, really by the 14th century, during the reign of the Iron King, Philip IV, became the Gallican behemoth that was really reinforced by the time of Louis XIV. It had come to completely eclipse any of the other Catholic monarchies in Europe, including that of the Empire, which had basically fallen into a state of intermittent interregnum throughout the remainder of the 13th and indeed the 14th centuries. And so there was no real competitor for the most Christian king. Indeed, elevating the monarchy in France as such, and also declaring that the king was a representative of spiritual peace, in many ways actually subordinated the papacy to the secular ambitions of the King of France. And when the papacy, as we see with figures like Boniface VIII, tried to assert its rights vis-a-vis the King of France, they ended up effectively being murdered and posthumously declared a heretic by the king, who was saintlier and prepared to more vociferously enact the wishes, again, of good Christians everywhere over the reluctance and recalcitrant papacy. So the king, essentially, again, is akin to Christ. It is the hypostatic union, the divine and the human in one body. And regarding the whole notion of the royal touch, I want to emphasize again this notion of the royal touch, the king's ability to lay hands and to cure the sick, as being perhaps again the greatest expression of a certain belief in miracles. Again, if you're a Catholic, you have to believe in miracles, and by extension, nothing confirms the inner belief in the king as this sacred entity than the belief that he himself can commit and contribute to the whole nature of miracles. Indeed, as we see, the sainted king, Louis IX, is intrinsically related with the use of miracles, otherwise he wouldn't be sainted. This fact is simply confirmed long beyond this period of time we're talking about, being the 14th century. So, for example, the French jurist one, Charles de Grasset, writing in the 16th century, so this around the time of King Francis I of France, declared that the King of France was not only the vicar of Christ in his kingdom, but a God in bodily form. And as Van Kley also notes, jurists of this era had recourse to the metaphor of Christ's marriage to the church in order to express the inalienability of the royal domain conceived of the realm's dowry to the king. The king's funeral mass, of course, represented the death and the resurrection of France, one and the same. Indeed, in his Parisian letters, this is in 1721, during the earlier reign of Louis XV, Montesquieu, one of the greatest of the, if not the philosophes, then the proto-philosophes, author of The Spirit of Laws, had his Persian traveller, Uzbek, write from Paris that the King of France is a great magician. This king went so far as to make his subjects believe that he can cure them of all kinds of diseases by touching them. So great is his force and power over their minds. From the point again of Montesquieu, he's looking at this as with a sense of incredulity, as a lot of quote unquote enlightened opinion in France at that time attests to. And as someone is mentioning, Prince Josephus Komnenos, in the House of Healing, King Aragon is explicitly associated with the royal touch, albeit when Tolkien is talking about the royal touch, he's not just playing on the French tradition, but also the fact that the curing of scrofula is also associated with English monarchy as well. Interestingly enough, not with all monarchs, but in particular between the English and the French monarchs. So this is the time I want to come to the book, really, on the royal touch, by one of France's most famous historians, Marc Bloch, or was one of France's most famous historians, and look at the decline of the state of the royal touch, and indeed the inner conviction and belief during the reign of Louis XV, before I get onto the topic of Gallicanism. This healing rite went on being solemnly performed in France by her kings during the 18th century. We have only a single figure for Louis XV, and that one is only approximate for the number of sick that were touched. This was on the 29th of October, 1722, the day after his consecration, when more than 2,000 scrofula sufferers appeared before him in the Saint-Remy parks at Reims. It is clear that there was no falling off in the old popularity of this rite. In other words, at the time when Montesquieu was writing his Persian letters with a certain aspect of incredulity, within the population, as refers to the population of France at large, the belief is that the young king, Louis XV, if I recall, inherited the throne of France at the age of 4, was still capable of performing this ancient rites that goes back to the most hallowed traditions of Clovis, Pepin the Short, Charlemagne, and Saint Louis. Nevertheless, this reign, that being Louis XV, remarkable all through for the decadence of the monarchy's prestige, delivered a severe blow to the ancient ceremony of the royal touch. 3 times at least it failed to take place through the fault of the king. By ancient custom, the king could not proceed to heal until he had at first received communion, and this is alluding to what I will be talking about later with the crisis of the sacraments. Now in 1739, Louis XV, who had just become involved in an intrigue with one Madame de Mailly, who refused access to the Holy Table by his confessor, and so did not make his Easter communion, and this being the first of many dalliances that we're going to be discussing. Likewise, at Easter 1740 and Christmas 1744, Louis had to abstain from communion, and on these occasions he did not give the royal touch. There was a great scandal about it in Paris, at any rate in 1739. These interruptions in the miracle, occasioned by the king's misconduct, seemed likely to break the habits of the crowds who normally flocked to him. As for cultivated circles, there was less and less attempt to veil their skepticism. As early as 1721, the Persian letters were already treating the royal magician with a certain frivolity. That's the letter I mentioned about Montesquieu. Saint-Simon, writing in his memoirs between 1739 and 1751, makes fun of the poor Princess de Soubise, Louis XIV's mistress, who was said to have died of scrofula. And the implication there, if you can't already tell, is that there is no one going to be quite as touched by the king as the one Princess de Soubise. There is a fierce flavour about this anecdote, but it is probably inaccurate, for it is quite likely that the Madame de Soubise was never the king's mistress, and it appears that she did not suffer from scrofula. But that, again, should only underline the fact that by the 1740s and 50s, the king and his seeming lack of ability in order to achieve this was made the object of popular ridicule and scandal. Saint-Simon probably picked up this slanderous tale from court gossip heard in his younger days, but the twist he gives, it certainly seems to prove that almost in spite of himself, he had been influenced by a new spirit. He goes so far as to speak that the miracle that people claim to be associated with the touch of kings, not only in his correspondence, but more openly in his questions for the encyclopedia, Voltaire cannot resist making fun of the dynasty's miraculous virtues and delights in picking out certain resounding failures. According to him, Louis XI proved incapable of healing St. Francis of Paula, and Louis XIV, one of his mistress, the Madame de Soubise, no doubt although she was well and truly touched. In his Essai sur le mot, he put before the French kings as a model the example of William of Orange, who renounced this prerogative and dares to add, "The time will come when reason, which is already beginning to make some headway in France, will abolish this custom. The disrepute into which the age-old right had fallen has one very serious disadvantage as far as we are concerned. It makes the writing of this history particularly difficult." Emphasis again, the example of William of Orange, who willingly abandons this right of prerogative. William of Orange, for reference, was the king who came to power in the Glorious Revolution, also known as the Dutch coup of 1688. His predecessor, King James II, who was a Catholic, and his brother, the earlier king, King Charles II, had performed the rite extensively, especially in the aftermath of the English Civil War, the War of the Three Kingdoms. So not only was William of Orange committing some sort of revolution by not continuing again the practice of the royal touch, but he was directing it as a certain admonition against Catholic or crypto-Catholic superstition of the monarchy. The last monarch for reference in England who seriously used the touch was Queen Anne. And it became a certain, again, priority of the Jacobite pretender to be able to claim that he could use the royal touch. And indeed, King James II would use the royal touch in his French exile. So this is again to say is that, unfortunately, for the case of Louis XVI, Louis XVI will unwillingly be placed in a position where he will essentially be made, like William of Orange, not to abandon this pagan superstition as far as the Protestants are concerned on his own volition, but as a consequence of the French Revolution. Louis XVI, faithful to an ancient usage, was confronted on the day of his consecration with a crowd of 2,400 sufferers from Scrofula. Did he, like his predecessors, continue to touch on the great feasts? It seems likely he did so. In any case, the miracle certainly no longer took place in the same peaceful atmosphere as it had in the past. It seems that under Louis XV, from the consecration ceremony onwards, the king, doubtless with the best of intentions, sincerely believing that he was following ancient custom, had slightly changed the traditional form of words accompanying the royal touch on each occasion. In the second clause, the words "Dieu t'en guérit," God heals thee, has been altered to "May God heal thee." In other words, kind of like a little Protestant addition, which is meant to signify, and not the words translating the bread and the wine into the body and the blood. The Catholics focus on transubstantiation, the desire that essentially God may heal the sick seems again to be perhaps interestingly perhaps an accidental or perhaps an intentional desire essentially to claim some plausible deniability for the king were he not capable of the sacrament. It is true that since the 17th century, some writers who do depict the ceremony give this turn of phrase, but there are as of yet very few witnesses of authority or official standing. More instructive still is an episode of healing certificates, which offer a vivid contrast from the beginning to the end of the 18th century. Not long after Louis XV's coronation, one Marquis of Argenson, then the Intendant of Hainaut, discovered within his jurisdiction an ex-patient who had been touched by the king on his journey to Rheims, and 3 months later found himself cured. The Marquis at once drew up a case history after many inquiries and authentic attestations of the facts, and sent it with all speed to Paris, thinking it would be flattering to the king's pride and a means of paying his court. But he received a disappointing response. The Secretary of State, Lavrilliere, replied curtly that things were just as they should be. No one had any doubts about the gift of performing these marvels possessed by our kings. The desire to prove a dogma might well seem to true believers to cast suspicion or doubt upon its truth. Indeed, that's true. But 52 years later, things were different. A certain Rémy Rivière of the parish of Montaigu had been touched by Louis XVI at Rheims and was cured. The Intendant of Chalon, one de Orfois, learnt of the fact and hastened to send to Versailles on the 17th of November 1775 a certificate signed by the surgeon of the place, as well as by the curé and the chief inhabitants. In other words, at the beginning of the reign of Louis XV, the idea that the monarchy would need to prove the basis of the royal touch was seen as an assault on the assumed miraculous nature of it. And in the case of Louis XVI, the whole nature of the cure was seen as so preposterous that it needed to be proved for the sake of an incredibly dubious and skeptical audience, which indeed it was. So this is the time that we come to Gallicanism, in particular, Gallicanism resisting the Reformation. It's a very interesting question as to why France did not decide to go over in the 16th century to the cause of Protestantism, referencing this painting in particular, which is perhaps the most infamous existence of the reason of state, which is France pursuing its foreign policy objectives to the detriments of other Catholic rulers. Perhaps again, there could have been a certain logic in France going along and adopting, if not again a hardcore Lutheran or even Calvinist interpretation of religion, then trying to find a middle road like Matthew Parker and Queen Elizabeth in England. But alas, it remained Catholic. And Van Kley, returning to him, offers an explanation as to why that was. By the 16th century, the cult of the French monarchy had acquired a critical mass, as it were, and had become so inextricably entwined in miracles, relics, and saints, and mostly received divine majesty, that any religious reform that reserved majesty for God alone, regarded Christ's passions as an unrepeatable event, minimized the miraculous, and put Christians on guard against wonder workers, regarded relics and images of the so many manifestations of idolatry and superstition, and those of Saint Denis in particular, as a lie, was obviously asking the monarchy to redefine itself in many ways. And then combine this notion of the attack on the sacraments and their association with monarchy, which Van Kley has explained as a critical mass for belief in the monarchy in France, with the iconoclasts. Calvinist iconoclasts in the 1560s cannot be credited with having tried very hard to essentially ingratiate themselves with the cause of monarchy. They ravaged the tomb of Louis XI at Kley, burned the heart of Francis II at Orleans, exhumed the body of Joan of France at Bourges, and desecrated the tombs of the Bourbons at Vendôme. In particular, Francis II had just died. He was king until 1561. So it wasn't just the fact that they were desecrating the bodies of previous French monarchs, they were predecessing. Now this would have been King Charles IX, the son of Catherine de Medici's elder brother. It would have struck a particular chord at that time with the French monarchy, especially given so much of the French wars of religion was about the Huguenot Protestants capturing the king in order to control him. When they, being the Calvinists, defiled consecrated hosts, felled statues of the saints and the Virgin, and smashed stained glass windows, Calvinist iconoclastic crowds in Capetian France implicitly struck at the symbols of the monarchy along those with Catholicism. The incompatibility of Calvinist iconoclasm and the denigration of the miraculous with the French royal religion is perhaps nowhere more poignantly dramatized than in the spectacles of Henry of Navarre abjuring his heresy near relics of Saint Denis, or of King Henry IV touching the Scrofula in Paris shortly after his coronation and consecration ceremony at Chartres. In other words, unlike what we saw with William of Orange, when Henry IV, or as he was previously known, Henry of Navarre, converted to Catholicism in order to become King of France, he consciously readopted the practice of sacred kingship and of the laying of hands in order to confirm his legitimacy. This at a time where his ascension to the monarchy was incredibly contentious. The Spanish and the Catholic League in France had attempted to put one Cardinal de Bourbon in power as Charles X, and the papacy had excommunicated him. Only reluctantly would the papacy begin to reconcile him towards the end, finally, of the 16th century. So again, this is significant. Nothing, you can say, would act as a rebuke against Protestantism in France than the Huguenot king, Henry of Navarre, performing the sacrament of the royal touch, or the religious rite, essentially, of the royal touch. So there is a possibility that with Francis I and Gallicanism, France faces an Anglican conundrum. By that, what I essentially mean is that England formed a full schism with Rome under Henry VIII. but Henry VIII maintained many of the outward forms of Catholicism until his death. It wasn't really until his son, Edward VI, and many Protestants in power, such as Thomas Cranmer and the Seymour family, did Protestantism really get going in England. And then under Elizabeth, we have the Act of Uniformity, which tries to harmonize many of the more moderate elements of Protestantism with a religion around the monarchy. And it's this friction, you can say, about addressing Protestant concerns and trying to reify the monarchy that bleeds into the English Civil War, and the Puritan movement causes much skepticism and non-conformity with the established church in England. So it's not simply a case of Francis going the way that the English did. He still would have faced many of the issues that we see with Anglicanism, and indeed the monarchy in England fell, having again undergone its reformation long before Francis did, even at the height of the wars of religion. So that again is to try and understand the context of France and this Gallican tendency of exalting the French monarchy, essentially not going over to the Anglican communion or schism with Rome, because being in communion with Rome also allowed France to gain various allies, invariably also the Papal States, against the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, whilst also again affording them a certain freedom with Francis I's very dubious foreign policy to ally with Protestant nations and indeed Muslim nations against the Habsburg monarchy. All this leads is that having a French monarchy, which has been tempted, you can say, and at one point you can say there was a possibility, had the Huguenots been able to take control of the king in the French wars of religion, of making the king Protestant, Henry of Navarre's conversion to Catholicism ends those hopes. And so in order for the French monarchy to assert its rights as the most Christian monarchy in Europe, and to assert its right as the eldest daughter of the church, it is not just in terms of trying to maintain its own supremacy within France, but you can say its own prestige within the rest of Europe, and trying again to buttress its claims of royal power and the idea that France is the first kingdom in Europe against a rejuvenated Holy Roman Empire and the monarchy of Spain under the Habsburgs. So from the outset, what basically emerges as Gallicanism, which is the French church still in union with Rome and not formally in schism, is the Sacred Monarchy Compromise. And I'm returning to Van Kley here. Confessional options available to the monarchy consisted in a choice between competitive Catholicisms. The zealotry of the Holy Union, what had already been called the Party of the Devout, entailed an extermination of heresy in France and a pro-Catholic Habsburg policy in Europe. A more politique or Gallican Catholicism, called that of the Bon François, good Frenchman, invited the pursuit of the monarchy's dynastic interests in both France and Europe to the detriment of its Catholic identity and relations with the papacy. As mentioned, the example with Solomon you can see being the most obvious. Balancing a third one, the one actually taken, consisted of an uneasy compromise between these two extremes, balancing a vigorous assertion of the crown's religious, even specifically Catholic identity on the one hand, and its dynastic interests, both in France and in Europe on the other. This compromise made up the posture of Bourbon absolutism. The term absolutism refers primarily to the increase in claims to power made by the monarchy and its apologists, only secondarily to the institutionalization of these claims. Central to these claims is one John Bardon's famous definition of sovereignty as an absolute and perpetual power, as well as an indivisible thing, a power capable of laying down law to all general and each in particular, without the consent of anyone above, below, or outside it, save God alone. It is therefore appropriate that Baudin himself should have been only a reluctant member of the Catholic League, i.e. the Holy Union or the Party of the Devout, for the tone of his book, The Six Livres, or the Six Books of the Republic, published in 1576, which in so many ways charted the course of the Bourbon monarchy, was decidedly in favour of the politique faction, in other words, in favour of the monarchy, almost as alien to the Catholic League's Catholicism as it was to the Protestant monarchomac constitutionalism. It should be, again, informative to mention a bit of the context of the French wars of religion. The French wars of religion undergirded so much of the policy of the Bourbons. It was really absolutism in many ways, an escape from falling into the crisis of religious division and constant political crisis, when in the 1560s and 70s, as I've mentioned, with those outbursts of Calvinist iconoclasm, that so much of the nobility of France went over, actually inspired directly on their route to the Italian wars in Geneva by the commune of John Calvin, that they came and became devout Protestants. A whole section of the war again devolved into this idea not just of the identity of France, but foreign powers taking an active interest in the affairs of France as well. So the Protestants were invariably propped up by the Dutch and the English, while the Catholics were propped up by the Habsburgs and the Spanish. This essentially meant that the monarchy, under Henry III in particular, pursuing the politique course, is not simply a matter, as we see here with Francis I, in terms of being able to pursue a very dubious foreign policy for the sake of expanding France, but in the case of Henry III, make it as sympathetic to him as possible. You can say that Henry III was trying to define a system of French sovereignty, and by sovereignty we see it with John Baudon's expression, but more than that, French independence vis-a-vis the entreaties of the other powers, whether it be not just the Spanish monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy, or the English monarchy, but also that of the papacy. So you could see that Henry of Navarre, being a Protestant, being a Huguenot, could have come to power as being in alliance, or in many ways being the puppet of Elizabeth of England, but instead he converts to Catholicism and pursues this politique middle way of asserting the independence of France. And so that again is part of the bedrock of the Gallican Compromise, is the assertion of French independence, which eventually converts into sovereignty. And sovereignty, as we'll see, as the factor was opposed by devout Catholics, has implications for the whole notion of existing as a Catholic monarchy in Europe. As translated and expanded upon by royal apologists and imperfectly implemented by the French monarchy itself, these elements of Baudin's definition took the form of a heightened accent on the king's legislative will, i.e. his ability to make laws, as opposed to his justice, on succession to the throne by virtue of his dynastic blood right, as opposed to law, and the studious demotion of competing institutions like the parliaments and the estates general. During the French wars of religion, many of the institutions had been of dubious loyalty, and indeed the Paris Parlement and the city of Paris in particular. And as we'll see, that dubious loyalty of the institutions is a continuing feature that in many ways, from the point of view of the defenders of the monarchy, in other words, the politic faction, would necessitate the call of demoting these institutions and ensuring the absolute monarchy. In principle, absolute monarchy remained different from a despotic or a seigneurial monarchy by being limited by divine, natural, and constitutional law. What I think he means by seigneurial, it almost sort of harkens back to Diocletian, using the term dominus ad deus, i.e. dominus as lord, to be lord over one's kingdom without, again, any sort of legal sort of natural encumbrances to power. In practice, as numbers of recent studies have underscored, Bourbon absolutism was never entirely able to institutionalize its claims to undivided power, even at its height under Louis XIV, although its successors were more salient in religious affairs than in others. By itself, however, Baudin's definition of sovereignty is incomplete as a characterization of absolutism because it is insufficiently religious. In other words, you can say it will later follow on from John Locke and his whole idea of the Leviathan, that you can see a form of absolutism which places the state above that of religion. For Baudin and his definition, and what William Church would also show, coalesced during the later 16th and early 17th century with a resacralization and even divinization of the French monarchy to make it more akin to that of a god, though foreign to Baudin's book, arose similarly in reaction to the wars of religion. By the 1625s, this during the reign of Louis XIII, the Bishop of Chartres, one Léonard d'Étampes, ventured the opinion that there is no one who does not hold and believe that the King of France is in no way mortal, but instead something very like the deity and similar to him, Well, just a few years later, the future academic Guise de Balzac commended the Roman practice of emperor worship as worthy of emulation, maintaining that Louis XIII in particular was so saintly that he had never lost the innocence vouchsafed to him by baptism. In other words, the king is so sacred, he is not tainted with the Augustinian notions of and broader notions of original sin, which should be interesting for the Jansenist connection, which we're going to get into. But again, it almost seems that we're going beyond Constantine here. We're going back to Diocletian, which is why I emphasize that interpretation of what Van Kley means by seigneurial. Far from representing a secularization of French political thinking, the Church had argued Richelieu's notorious politics of reason of state presupposed this divinization and made sense in the cardinal minister's own mind only on the assumption of France's special relation to God and the sacrosanctity of French kingship. Sorry, I thought I said Thomas Hobbes. Thank you, Prince Joseph Komnenos. So that again is a major sort of recommitment to the idea that if you elevate the king such, if you de-emphasize his relationship and you can say subordination to other European sovereigns like the Holy Roman Emperor and like the Pope, then anything that the king wills can be seen in accordance with God wishes, because the king is nearer to him and more akin to a god than he is akin to man. The more sovereign France, again, needs to be in order to pursue its aims, by extension, the more sacrosanct and beyond accountability the king needs to be, without judge. And you can say, again, that could be pursued very cynically in terms of foreign policy. And if you have to look, as the Parti de Vous, as the Holy League, as the Catholic League during the French Wars of Religion did, at the unity of Christendom, wanting to bring France over into the Habsburg and indeed the Spanish camp, then what this basically means is that a Catholic France, which is fully sovereign with a divinized monarch, will effectively be in a position to wage wars against other Catholic sovereigns and, you can say, be a menace to Catholic peace. This is why you can read Gallicanism as, and so much of it, as this preamble to the process of dechristianization, because what had originally elevated the kings and the kingship since Robert II and Abbé Suger and Louis VII is that to identify the cause of France with the papacy would again identify it with the cause of broader Europe. But here, Europe is playing second fiddle, and indeed the papacy is playing second fiddle to the whole notion of France. So instead, the notion of the monarchy in France representing Christ's peace is now being inverted to represent Richelieu's and later Louis XIV's wars. You can say, looking at it from that point of view, which I will, there is a certain perversity in Gallicanism which completely upends the whole notions of what Christian kingship began, how you would say, for example, see it under Saint Louis in the 13th century. The conceptual task of facing the politique as Catholic loyals to the cause of the Bourbon dynasty were pejoratively called, was therefore to seal off chinks in the monarchy's Gallican armor, to make the monarchy invulnerable to both revolt by the Protestants and assassination by the League's priestly preachers and monks. That new suit of armor was the proposition that the French king was accountable to God alone. It already appeared in all syllables in the last decades of the 16th century in the work of the politique publicists who combined it with Baudin's novel definition of sovereignty, but it did not officially surface this idea of divine right monarchy until the Third Estate demanded that it be recognized as a fundamental law of the realm by the Estates General of 1614, drafted by a parliamentary barrister named Anton Arnauld. A prophetic touch, the proposition specified that the king is recognized as sovereign in his state, not holding his crown from anyone but God. There is no power on earth, whether temporal or spiritual, which is the least right over his realm, which, as it would, take away the sacred persons of the king. In other words, the whole sort of logic of trying to make the king independent of faction, religious factions, foreign factions, in the French Wars of Religion has led to a Gallican solution where the monarchy is basically turned into a god. The irony, however, note that it was the Estates General of 1614 who insisted on the notion of this sovereign divine right. This body, and of the Third Estate in particular, demanding this declaration, would not be summoned again until 1789. And when it was summoned again in 1789, the Third Estate would take on a role of deliberately and provocatively undermining the king's authority by declaring themselves a constituency of the French nation. Nothing could better illustrate the radical diminution of the French monarchy than an Estates General where the Third Estate had demanded the king be ruled by divine right and accountable essentially to no higher authority than God. And in 1789, where the whole notion of divine right has been thrown out of the window, and instead the monarchy has been replaced by an increasingly dechristianized aspect of national sovereignty. So, what I'm trying to explain is that you can look at the period between Henry III and Louis XV. So this is the 1580s up until really the 1760s and the 1770s as a holding pattern. Indeed, you can say it's part of a cycle. And it's during this time that we have the Gallican period, the absolutist period, at its height in French history. But it really represents an intervening failure of Gallicanism because of so many of the inherent contradictions and the continuation of these two parties, the Protestant party critiquing it from one direction and the Catholic, you can say universalist, I'm not going to say necessarily papist, but friendlier, if not neutral, to the Habsburgs, not willing to engage in all these wars. Indeed, this alliance with the Ottoman Empire, it sort of continues on in various other veins. You can say again, as we have the attack on Vienna by the Turks in the 1520s, the French alliance and the Ottoman alliance reaches a new height during the reign of Louis XIV in the 1680s. You know, the monarchy and the Ottoman Empire were at its sort of territorial and prestigious heights in the 1680s. And so when the Turks were dramatically defeated in 1683, they were turned away, and the fall of the Turkish Empire in Hungary and much of the Balkans actually ensured, you can say, the failure of Louis XIV's more sort of lofty aspirations. So what are, you can say, the deviations of Gallicanism? If we're going to look at Gallicanism as the monarchy would have it, which is basically divinity and sovereignty, to be accountable to no one and allow the French monarchy continue in whatever foreign policy or domestic sphere they could possibly want without major ramification, even if it means essentially tearing apart the unity of Christendom and the unity of Europe, as was the case in Louis XIV's wars, and which you can say engendered so many coalitions, and indeed such a dramatic reversal of alliances like we see with William of Orange and the Dutch taking power in England in 1688. The height of Gallicanism in France, in terms of looking at this for a process of legislation, one is the Gallican Declaration of 1682, which is to emphasize the independence of the church in France and the king's rights essentially to appoint bishops. And indeed, it's part of a broader political program called conciliarism, which is promoting not just the bishops, but all of the bishops, the entire unity of the church against the Pope. But because, again, it's very rare that all of the Catholic bishops ever get together in an ecumenical council. The last one that should be mentioned was the Council of Trent over 150 years ago. Yet in reality, it means the king has a lot more sway over the bishops within his kingdom to determine his own religious policy. If, again, you're going to look at some precedent for this, Louis XIV, through his expansion, had a process essentially drawn up called the Chambers of Reunion, whereby land was restored on the left bank of the Rhine, arguing that it essentially belonged to France based on some 9th century Carolingian precedent. So Louis XIV, his advisors and his jurists were thinking along these lines. And so the Gallican Declaration was obviously drawn up with an intention of imitating Charlemagne, which is that the king has the right to convoke his own religious councils and determine the religious settlement of his realm. And by extension, if Louis XIV were able to win all of his wars, unseat the Habsburgs, perhaps prop up the Bavarians as a puppet empire, a puppet emperor, or failing that, turn around and actually appoint a Bourbon to become the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, this whole notion of French national sovereignty could have imposed itself as a new Carolingian empire, something the Bonapartists would like to achieve. The other aspect of this is Catholic conformism, which is the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, which, first of all, there had been a series of actions placed against the Huguenots. One was the Dragonards, whereby the Huguenots were essentially forced to have soldiers billeted on the frontier during the war. And with Fontainebleau, we see the expulsion of the Huguenots, and many of them go to places like Holland, places like Prussia, and places like England. This was actually following in a tradition that had been set elsewhere in Europe, that the ruler of the realm has the right to determine his religion, and to the point of view, absolutely, that there will be no non-Protestants in a Protestant nation or no Catholics in a Catholic nation. So really, Louis XIV is simultaneously asserting the independence of the national church, of the national Catholic Church within France, whilst also imposing Catholicism uniformly, as we see with the whole, even the right of naturalization in France as being dependent on the church. And then the final sort of instance of this in terms of the law of the land and the church is unigenitus. During the previous century, the 17th century, there was a religious movement which, if I believe, originated in the Low Countries, but was later propagated in France at the Palais Royal, called Jansenism. And Jansenism presents itself as the sort of truest exponents of Saint Augustine of Hippo, Augustinianism, which results in many things, but you can say the key emphasis is on a general skepticism towards the sacrament of confession, the emphasis on venial sin, the repetition of venial sin in particular, and condemnation of what they believe to be semi-Pelagian aspects of the Catholic Church, especially accusations against the more sort of controversial aspects of the Jesuits. And then there were more radical aspects of the Jansenists who, from the Abbey of Saint-Médard, went on and practiced miracles, such as the Convulsionnaires. But there was also an air, as is often the case with these sort of things, in a sense of intense religiosity. There was also an intense sort of moral lapse or moral abandonment, sort of purveying this sort of air of religiosity. But another aspect of this, the more mundane aspect of this, is that many Jansenists became basically hereditary jurists and parliamentarians in the various parlements that made up of France. So the Pope promulgates his bull Unigenitus in 1713, which, after a long period of contention with the Jansenists, basically bans Jansenism. And in 1721, in the earlier reign of Louis XV, it becomes a basis of French law, which is progressively sort of enforced until, you could say, the height of 1730 to 1733. You can perhaps see that among these edicts there is a bit of contradiction here. The Gallican Declaration was all about asserting the independence of the French Church. The Edict of Fontainebleau, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Henry IV, it should be mentioned, was all about imposing a uniform Catholicism, but with the assumption that the king basically determined the Catholicism within France. And Unigenitus is a law being implemented in France by a cardinal, Cardinal Fleury, which essentially bound France to a papal bull. So on the one hand, you can say that a feature of Gallicanism is the assertion of sovereignty, yet because the Gallican Church never divided itself from Rome fully, it never went full schismatic like we see with the Anglicans, a part of ensuring religious conformity in France involves having deference to Orthodox Catholicism and in so following the edicts of the Pope. Because again, the King of France, especially Louis XIV towards the end of his reign, where he rose back on some of the most extreme elements of his Gallican Declaration in 1793 and 1795, is alive to the fact that he is not in a position to routinely piss off the Pope without the fear basically of inviting reprisals, not just from other European sovereigns, but also from inside France itself. It required a delicate balancing act in order to ensure this religious settlement, the pacification of internal and external forces. So this is where we get to Van Kley again, because Van Kley's quite sort of forceful belief is that the role of unigenitus played a significant part in damaging the monarchy and by association Louis XV. At one point, Cardinal Fleury felt strong enough to attempt a structural solution to the problem of appeals and problems like it, a royal declaration that would fortify once and for all the status of unigenitus as a law of church and state, and disallow all appeals having to do with it. This declaration, dated the 24th of March 1730, declared the bull to be a judgment of the universal church in a matter of doctrine, reiterated a requirement to sign Pope Alexander VII's formulary for all candidates to benefices, and prescribed silence on all parties to dispute over unigenitus, threatening them with exemplary punishment for violations of this silence, except for bishops as pastors of their flocks, forcibly registered by Fleury and his Chancellor de Jussau in a Lit de Justice, assembly of the 3rd of April. Lit de Justice literally just means the bed of justice. When the monarchy wanted to impose a law, it did so by imposing a lit de justice, which essentially acknowledged that the right of Parliament wasn't to debate, it wasn't to deliberate, it certainly wasn't to have the right to legislate on its own initiative, but it was simply there to ratify the royal edicts. The declaration provoked the Abbé Pucelle to say there had in effect declared the king a vassal of the Pope, a venerable Villard, Leclerc de la Saville, to implore the king on bended knee. In other words, if you're going to again look at the idea of having a uniform Catholicism combined with this Gallican sentiment, then the Gallican sentiment is actually rising in opposition to the imposition of a uniform Catholicism within France. The declaration of the 24th of March 1730, which enshrined unigenitus as both the law of the church and state, took its place alongside the declaration of the 14th of May 1724, which codified and strengthened all the 17th century statutes against the so-called Reformed religion, in other words, Calvinism, and the newly converted Catholics, in other words, the Jansenists, reinforcing the fiction that there were no Protestants in France. This new declaration made Catholic priests parties and judges in their own cause by giving them the sole right to attest to the Catholic nature of suspected Protestants, failing which their marriages were reputed as concubinages, their children as illegitimate, and adult Protestants themselves subject to deportation, galley labour, or death, depending on whether they were women, men, or pastors. And reinforcing the declarations concerning Jansenism and Protestantism in a sense was the Edict of 1723, known as the Printers and Booksellers Code, which similarly codified and fortified the monarchy's many legislative attempts at control over the printed word that had begun with the Protestant Reformation. In other words, this is further an attempt to impose a regime of outward Catholic faith on, you can say, devout believing Frenchmen and also Protestants or Jansenists, combined with a new intensified regime of censorship. Yet Fleury's various gains in this crisis came at the cost of considerable longer-run liabilities. Fleury's declaration of March of 1730 may have finally enshrined this unigenitus as a law of church and state alongside the Edict of Fontainebleau, that being the revocation of the rights of Huguenots in France. But by also having unigenitus declared a judgment of the universal church in matter of doctrine, Fleury encouraged zealously bishops to proceed through appellants were heretics, while by warning that the bull was not a rule of faith, Fleury encouraged the parliaments to proceed as though these bishops were troublemakers. In the short run, Fleury was able to keep devout episcopal firebrands in check and prevent the wholesale refusal of sacraments, but not before bishops like Lefebvre had sounded a constitutionary tocsin, articulating an ideology that would survive to haunt the monarchy when a cardinal bishop was no longer there to dispel it. Fleury may have crushed Jansenism as a clerical and theological force while humiliating the Parliament of Paris, its ally, but not for proselytizing Jansenism, as well as effacing its juncture with Parlement, producing a judicial Jansenism that would do so far more damage to the episcopacy and the monarchy than either Jansenism or the Parliament had ever done separately. What he really means there is that, as contained within a broader sort of Catholic, you can say big tent Catholicism, the issue of Jansenism would have been less detrimental to the Catholic Church in France, because many Jansenists also happen to be Gallicans. And this underlines, you can say, a core element, is that there is a Gallican Jansenist Protestant tendency that tends now, because you can say of this intensive process of vilification of Jansenists and pushing them away from the Catholic Church and into the Protestant cause, albeit again covertly because they have to outwardly profess Catholicism. They disassociate with the monarchy and instead they emphasize a new form of Gallicanism, which is national sovereignty over monarchical sovereignty. Part of this is expressed by the interest in the Paris Parlement, because the parliaments become so associated with the cause of the Protestants and the Jansenists opposing royal authority. Part of this emphasis on national sovereignty is an appeal to constitutionalism, like the Estates General. So within this Gallican Jansenist Protestant tendency, we have figures like Legros, who argues for conciliarism, the power of the bishops in France. Then we have figures like Laborde, who emphasizes that the Estates General ought to have preeminence over the monarchy in France. And if you're looking at this from the conciliarist point of view, it goes hand in hand. If the councils of the church and the bishops as a whole have more power than the Pope, then why shouldn't the Estates General, which represents the entire estates of the realm, have more power than the king? And this was explained with a book called Franco-Gallia, which claimed that Clovis received his authority by right of a sacred pre-Merovingian council, a sacred Frankish council, and that it was the council, the Germanic right, you can say, to appoint and elect a king, which ought to have preeminence over the king himself. And as you can see, already within this tendency, we see a lot of the arguments that were brought up during the French Wars of Religion, which is once the king became inextricably associated with Catholicism after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where there was a pogrom in Paris, in part instigated by Catherine de' Medici, where thousands of Protestants and many prominent Huguenot leaders were murdered at a wedding in Paris, held, it should be mentioned, for Henry of Navarre. The king thereafter became associated so much with Catholicism and demonized that the Protestants began to outwardly profess elements of republicanism and national sovereignty. In other words, there had always been a tenet within the Protestant movement in France towards what we will later see with the French Revolution, which is why you can see in many of the cases of the French Revolution that an argument can be made and was made, and there was a consciousness at the time that with the failure of absolutism, or you can say the declining fortunes, the diminishing of absolutism and faith in the monarchy in Louis XV, that we are returning to a cycle where we have a figure like Henry III who becomes the victim of a regicide, and then a new religious settlement that is brought in per Henry IV. All of this is very interesting, but this, again, contention that there was a recurring cyclical religious element that bleeds through into much of the early French Revolution is not just my belief, but it is the belief, certainly, of many clerics and commentators at that time. Now I just want to refer again to Van Kley, and he is citing a judgment against the Council of Embrun in favor of a Jansenist bishop of Senez. This in particular being a judgment against Jansenism. The domination of temporal princes was altogether foreign to the church in the barrister's view. Jesus Christ himself told the apostles, and by clear implication their episcopal successors, that while the gentle princes, I just want to re-emphasize that, in favor of the Jansenist bishop of Senez, Jesus Christ himself told his apostles, and by clear implication their episcopal successors, that while the Gentile princes dominated each other, it shall not be so among you. Far from a temporal prince, therefore, who commanded in absolute manner, the church's pastors acknowledged Jesus Christ as their only king and monarch, which meant that they bore a much greater resemblance to magistrates as interpreters and protectors of the laws laid down by Christ's sovereign authority than to princes, i.e. the King of France, who at their whim could abrogate old laws and establish new ones, that being a main contention against the King of France, that he was simply the indicative of an arbitrary power. The barrister's assimilation of pastors to royal judge had other implications as well, among them that just as the king communicated his judicial authority to his whole parlement, and not to the first president only, so Christ communicated his spiritual authority directly to the universal church and not the Pope alone. For the barristers then, this universal church clearly meant that the clerical second order and even the lay people, as well as the bishops. This analogy further implied that, like the parliamentary magistrates, the church's pastors should be subject to papal pronouncement or decision, notably unigenitus, to a serious discussion and juridical examination, which in the church's case ought to continue until a clear, free, decisive, and unanimous acceptance has emerged. In other words, even from the Christian point of view, there was this tendency to getting rid of the whole notion of royal sovereignty and instead emphasizing the whole notion of Christ as king. If you again wonder, why there's this tendency, even you can say among integralists in America, who will again parrot the notion of Christ as king, it's actually uniquely convenient for a republican form of government to appeal to that, because the whole notion of princes, Christian princes, really going on since, Armenia converted first, but really going on from Constantine, is that the kings were at the very least intermediaries. And in the case of the sort of whole conceit of the French absolute monarchy, closer to the divine. If you get rid of kings, then there is this no greater intermediary. And so the republic, the people placed before God, can be better placed in a position where one can seriously say Christ is king, because you're appealing to the estates of the country, you're appealing to the people, to the corporations, to the church itself, all as basically representing an assembly before God. As mentioned, this is all part of a tradition, especially not just, this could be applied to Gallicanism, but this can also be applied to all of Christendom, where the king essentially becomes superfluous. And this, as far as Van Kley is concerned, is a byproduct of placing so much emphasis on unigenitus, that by placing so much, you can say, deference for a papal bull, invariably allows for Gallican attacks to be made on the king himself. So really, again, this is to illustrate in terms of the Catholic criticism of much of the universal monarchy, is that from the Catholic's point of view, there is a tendency towards this universalism and ultramonarchism, deference to the Pope. In the wars of religion, in the case of Henry III, he was murdered by a Dominican friar. And he was murdered by a Dominican friar because he had been an accomplice in 1589, because he had been an accomplice to the murder, the assassination of the leader of the French League, Catholic League, Henri, Duke of Guise. And so there was a logic among the Catholic monarchomarchs, those fighting against the monarchy, that tyrannicide could be justified. It was no longer regicide if one was fighting against an irreligious tyrant. Indeed, that was part of the same logic, it should be mentioned, for getting rid of King Charles in the English Civil War as well, the arguments, you can say, the forerunner for so much of what happened in England in the 17th century had actually occurred in France in the 16th century, as well as a lot of the political thinking that would later evolve, you can say, into Hobbes and his Leviathan. So all of this is setting up the French Revolution and its initial stages as emanating out of this conflict and the many contradictions that you can see in Gallicanism, conciliarism, constitutionalism, the emphasis on the estates and the council and the national community, the idea of Christ as king, and we needn't heed the interests of this almighty intermediary. He represents himself, the king. This whole notion that the king is fighting a war against other Catholics and he's using sovereignty basically as a smokescreen in order to justify it. All of this essentially comes down to a series of fundamental actions or failures in the 1750s and 60s, which culminate in the failure of Gallicanism before the French Revolution. So in 1757, you begin to see the process towards the suppression of the Jesuits and the serious end of enforcing unigenitus. What this represents is that the hardened Catholic defenders of the monarchy have basically been defeated. And they have been defeated by the work of the Parlement, who were basically aligned more or less to the Jansenists and the Protestants, more so, for example, than the hardcore Catholics, meaning that the king essentially had lost out on all of these Catholic conformist pretensions that we see with the Edict of Fontainebleau under Louis XIV. And we see a temporary victory, not just the forces of anti-Orthodox Catholicism, but also the forces of the estates and the institutions over the quote-unquote absolute monarchy. Even when Louis XIV retracted this great Gallican declaration of 1682 and 1693, it was done under the king's own volition. But here, it's basically been imposed as a settlement by the king's parliament. There was a general awareness after the wars of religion, and I don't necessarily mean this as a dechristianization as a whole, taking place within the nominal Catholic Church. The irony of all of this actually leads to a failure of foreign policy, which is in 1657, France goes to war with England, and it goes to war with Prussia. And it does so as a result of something called the diplomatic revolution. What this effectively meant is that because France was so decisively defeated, and all France was defeated by Prussia on the battlefield in Europe, it lost its influence in India, and it lost its influence in the Americas. In particular, it lost Canada. Part of the reason why we speak English essentially as the main sort of lingua franca or second language of the world is because of the 7 Years' War. We're not speaking French in many ways. And because of this, the policy of the French monarchy in order to buttress the whole idea of sovereignty, to continue and to fight wars, has been defeated by this complete and utter loss in a disastrous war against the English, whilst at the same time desperate to acquire funds to continue this war, conceding religious policy to the parliaments, who basically achieved the suppression of the Jesuits, thereby completing this long conflict between the Jansenists and the Jesuits. And the irony of all of this is that this had taken place amidst a diplomatic revolution where France was finally at peace and allied with its great Catholic rival, Austria, and what could have been, you can say, the reconciliation of much of the more radical Gallican elements by forming a broader Catholic alliance in Europe, because France was also, should we mention, allied with Catholic Spain and Catholic Naples, and to a lesser extent Catholic Poland, was all undone as a result of this incredibly embarrassing series of defeats. Everything essentially that Louis XIV have striven towards have been lost. So now I want to come to a crisis of sacramental monarchy. And this begins with quite a subtle point, which a lot of people may have overlooked, returning back to Van Kley, but it's the notion of automatic succession within the French monarchy, over this whole notion of the sacramental monarchy, or the baptism, or the confirmation with the sacred oil. For it is certain that the king never dies, as they say, as was John Baudin's explanation for how French royal sovereignty was perpetual, because as soon as one has died, the closest male of his stock is seized by the realm and in possession of it before he is crowned. This formula was nothing if not precarious, arbitrarily substituting king for royal authority and saying that had circulated wildly during the previous couple of decades. Moreover, it had legitimized what had hitherto only been a practice dating of a king's reign immediately following the death of his predecessor, a practice first imposed in 1270 by the contingency of Louis IX's death on crusade. Before, the reigns had not been dated until the ceremonies of consecration and coronation, which contained several electoral gestures. John Baudin's judicial legitimation of automatic biological succession did not wait long to assume a ceremonial form, showing up as early as it did in a studied de-emphasis of electoral elements in Henry IV's consecration and coronation at Chartres in 1594. And though probably unplanned, taking place only 12 hours after the assassination of Henry IV in 1610, the ceremonial improvisation whereby a prematurely crowned boy king Louis XIII presided over a Litre de Justice assembly well before either his father's funeral or his coronation at Reims, set an important precedent for the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV, similarly begun with regency governments, underscore the automatic, non-consensual character of dynastic succession. This new ceremonial emphasis on instantaneous biological dynastic succession also had the effect of downplaying those public ceremonies that feature the king in official or state-related capacities. This is the whole notion of ascension as opposed to coronation. You see it in many of the many sort of monarchies today. There is no sort of grandiose coronation ceremony. There is a simple accession ritual, which also is involved in England, which truly demarcates the point at which one becomes king. The irony, of course, is that England is simultaneously a Protestant and superficially maintains the outward appearance of being a sacred monarchy, which also includes the anointing, albeit with no claims essentially of seriously defending the Reformed Church, or really the idea that the king now can cure from Scrofula. But what that little passage again is to indicate, this whole notion of automatic succession, is actually the same with various monarchies that we see arising in the 19th century. So let's take two examples. The Austrian monarchy, the Austrian Empire, which was created in 1804, and the Bavarian Kingdom, which was created also in 1805. In both these systems, there is no coronation, despite, again, the alliance between church and monarchy being so intricate, being so indissoluble. There is only the ascension, and there is only the allusion to a crown, but really it performs no sort of serious function. The crown exists to demonstrate state power, but there is no necessity of having a coronation, thereby removing the clerical and in many ways the sacramental aspects of it. What role really does the coronation have as engendering this idea of the eighth sacrament if the king is already king? What is he really between the ascension and the coronation if he is already king? Does he become a greater king as a result of the coronation? Again, it's a question that hasn't really ever been answered. Of course, we have the practice of the royal touch following the coronation, but again, all of this is to assume what is more important in terms of the king's ascension, the automatic action and ceremony of ascension, or is it the coronation? All this is to emphasize is that having someone who automatically receives the power and the body of the French monarchy, the mystical corporation of the French monarchy, removed from its sacramental qualities, all this essentially is to illustrate is that there is a general redundancy in many aspects for these sacred rituals. They are no longer intrinsic, is how I'm probably going to best describe it, to the continuation of French monarchy. Rather, they become more ornamental. And that certainly is the case if you're going to compare this to the English monarchy, which has many of the outward demonstrations, the rituals, but if you're going to say, especially now, the sacred elements are really sort of nothing more than representing kitsch. Take this, and I want to combine this with another key element of the crisis of sacramental monarchy, which is the whole basis of Louis XIV's reign, which is that of Apollo, the sun god. In the case of Louis XIV's Versailles, quite literally, all the king's functions were made into official functions, and his least idiosyncrasy into an affair of state. The result was a total conflation of official with private time, or of immortal with mortal time, carrying with it a complete congruence of the king's hitherto distinguishable two bodies. Where the result should be thought of as the state or the king himself, probably the former is moot, because along with the personalization of power went the impersonalization of routine of power, having to do with the transition from judicial to administrative monarchy that was symbolized by the royal court of Versailles and the royal commissioner in the provinces. Why is this significant? If you understand the whole basis of the king's two bodies, it's to basically allow for the king to personally digress and fall into human error, which is the human aspect of him, while the other element represents the nation. And when the king dies, he does not die in the traditional sense, he demises. And as we see with the succession, the king is dead, long live the king. There is the funeral, which is the new mass of resurrection. The point about Louis XIV bringing all of the nobles into his new court, his remit, his orbit, almost literally, in Versailles, and undermining, you can say, the classical elements of French feudalism, is that by making all of his bodily functions, everything we're really talking about, from him getting up in the morning and being granted a piece of clothing, it all became part of an established ritual, that and his meals and everything, and of course his plays and his theatrical troupes, even his mistresses. Not to mention, of course, the more salubrious aspects of his reign, like attending church. If you remove the person and all you have is the state, Louis XIV is famously attributed the saying, "I am the state." Well, if everything you do, again, is to follow the French state, then it means that all of your failings, all of your misdeeds become inextricably associated with the French state itself. And of course, that's the sort of natural consequence of fusing all the human elements with all of the divine and the sacred elements. The permanent pageantry that had grown up around Louis XIV of Versailles had so personalized the monarchy, had so collapsed the king's mortal and sempiternal bodies, to use Kantorowicz terminology, that the monarchy now required its occupant's personality to be an entirely public personality. Louis XV's recent and somewhat sympathetic biographers, such as Michel Landon, have convincingly argued that Louis XV was intelligent and reasonably diligent about state business, but they have also conceded that he was shy and almost pathologically private. Alternatively, assuming in the appearance of haughty remoteness and glacial indifference, the king's public demeanour baffled contemporaries, who soon ran short of plausible explanations for his taciturnity and his apparent cruelty. And as we're going to see, that aspect of his aloofness is the least of his problems in terms of so deeply associating the king's personality with the fate of the monarchy. To the degree that the recent conflation of the two royal bodies survived these developments, it did so only in the minds of the Catholic party, i.e. the Holy League, the followers of Henry of Guise from the French Wars of Religion, those who are still believing in things like ultramontanism, which of course will be more likely to believe that because they don't want the king to be seen as a divine representation of the French nation, which is sort of sovereignty taken to its, and Gallicanism taken to its logical conclusion. Any such conflation of the king's two bodies made it more vulnerable to controversy about the sacraments. If, as Roger Chartier has argued, the king's person became at once a sign and the thing signified, both a representation of the monarchy and the monarchy itself, it bore an evident similarity to the Eucharistic sacrament that was also at once a sign of Christ's body and the body itself, and to the degree that it became analogous to their sacrament, the royal body was bound to suffer politicization, even desacralization, by performing badly in controversy, which tended to politicize and desacralize the sacraments themselves, and there is no want of evidence that for the portions of the Parisian population, something like that indeed took place. Nothing exhibits this better than what I alluded to earlier, which is the failure of the king's miracles and the abandonment of the royal touch in the 1740s following the king's various affairs. All of this essentially to say that if the king is remiss in his sacramental duties, if the king essentially is robbed of his healing powers, then not just is the king robbed, but the state is robbed, and indeed all of France is made the worst of it. In other words, the king and his own personal corruption, the more the sort of king sins, the more all of France suffers as a result of it. If the king's body and the state are seen as one and the same, and the king completely fails the Kantorowiczian notion of being the optimal man, the foremost representation, as say, for example, Dante would have looked at it, of secular rulership and kingship. So this again just illustrates the perils of the hypostatic union. All this really illustrates is that already just in the figure of the king, the sacraments have already come under attack. Automatic succession has made much of the sort of sacramental notion of the eighth sacrament of kingship seem redundant. It's simply a matter of the king automatically succeeding, and that way the king is no longer dependent on any supernatural law or church. In the case of the fusing of the king's two bodies, like we see with Louis XIV and the whole notion of the Sun King, absolute Gallican sovereignty, the absolute monarchy, creates this peril whereby the corruption of the king entails the corruption of the nation, and indeed you can say the abandonment of miracles, which further leads to ridicule and the accusations of certain superstition. But then conversely, we have the king and his condemnation of other miracles, in particular Jansenist miracles, which is quite ironic. Back to Van Kley. The religious damage to religiously defined monarch is most apparent in the popular reaction to the monarchy's opposition to the veneration of the deacon Paris and the closing of the cemetery of Saint-Médard, one of the greater Jansenist centres. All-powerful though he was, the king had no right to suppress the news of the marvels of God. The Parisian, they were said to have in reference to the deacon's thaumaturgical miracles, praising the sainthood of the abbé, in other words, thaumaturgical magic. Others went further, maintaining that one might doubt the divinity of God if the divine majesty did not reward those who had followed in his footsteps with apparent signs of their sainthood after their death, and that those, like the king, who combat his miracles are the enemies of truth and the partisans of paganism and impiety. Such partisans, it went without saying, were mortal as well as immoral. That, of course, was the profound meaning of the famous quatrain reportedly placarded onto the cemetery wall and noted by a police observer in 1732. By order of the king, it is forbidden to the divinity to perform any more miracles in his vicinity. What is curious about Jansenism versus Protestantism, and why, again, it will be a mistake to simply sort of view it as pure crypto-Hugonism, Calvinism, or whatever, is that contrary to a lot of Protestantism, there is a major emphasis on miracles and pomp and religious circumstance and relics. In other words, everything that philosophy and enlightened opinion would denigrate as superstition. This, along with many things, again, the claim can be made, actually makes Jansenism quite conducive to the Gallican monarchy. So again, attacking the miracles isn't so much, again, just attacking Jansenism, but it's the king who has become, you can say, so alienated from increasingly, because this is in 1732, it'll only increase as his reign goes on. The king becomes an object of religious disdain, not just among the philosophers, but also among the Jansenists, because he is seen as repressing God-given miracles. So there's another argument, which I personally am sort of in favor of, which is Louis XV becomes the prisoner of the sacramental system. in that the sacraments emerge from this point on as an outward form of fealty to the state. And one sort of example of this is the refusal of sacraments controversy. A figure known as Charles Coffin died in 1751, and because he was a Jansenist, or accused of being a Jansenist, he was denied the last rites as per the papal bull Unigenitus, after he failed to produce a certificate of confession. And there was such an uproar to this, essentially, that with the whole notion of the Viaticum, the last rites, that people were essentially being denied Christian burial and absolution because of their Christian heterodoxy, that because the king was seen as imposing this rule, where essentially the state and the priests were acting as officials of the king in imposing this desire again to have certificates of confession in order to receive burial in consecrated ground, it led to a process of increased attacks on the king. And indeed, it led to a greater sense of general skepticism about sacramental worship. You know, to be Catholic was to be French, so long as the king was France. All this does in many ways is that there are many who are outwardly Catholic who defer to the whole process of the Catholic rituals, the sacraments. But when it comes to people, again, with a more, you can say, fervent belief, they are being, again, told to oblige by this more outward form of Catholicism. And the whole sort of aspect of the Jansenists is actually very complicated, looking in terms of their overall skepticism of the sacraments, which I sort of mentioned earlier. It increases this sort of general antipathy among the Gallicans in particular. All this is to say that the king was perhaps right from the Catholic point of view in terms of trying to impose orthodoxy among his subjects, but the opinion of wider Parisian society and skeptical society of Catholicism is that a king is simply seen to be denying the sacraments and the last rites while he himself is directly flaunting them and causing basically miracles and miracle workers to be hunted down and imprisoned in the Bastille. You can say that these are, confused and sort of muddled views held by the Parisian population. Well, all this is to say that this whole notion of a united population under a united religion, under a pious, most Christian king, was in many ways a fiction at this time. And this is, to some extent, again, illustrated by the views of one Bishop Lefranc de Pompadour. Just give me a second in order to find my segment. Among devout apologists, only the Bishop of Puy Lefranc de Pompadour took up the religious gauntlet of the indivisible and pure interior faith. Catholicism's cult, ceremonies, sacraments, and preaching were, on the contrary, all very public and exterior. He had observed as the General Assembly's spokesman to the king in 1755, and he later rhetorically asked, if all of that fall under the purview of the secular authority, on the grounds that it was all to the exterior and public, what one must conclude, clearly that the state would rightfully decide whether such a book in dispute among Christians was canonical or not, whether the word of God was entirely contained in the Holy Scriptures, or whether part of it should be acknowledged as having been transmitted by word of mouth from the apostles to ourselves, whether this and that, and so on, until the state having decided on all of these exteriors, nothing remained of Catholicism except a religion entirely human in its essence. By contrast, the Elizabethan Church and much of the Church of England was no difference to this. That's why you have such a long tradition of nonconformism in the church, and the difficulty essentially of the nonconformists being able to show, again, outward deference to the monarchy. This also includes Catholics who weren't, quote unquote, emancipated until 1829. But what the Anglican Church had, which the Catholic Church in France did not have, was far more ample room for religious flexibility, in that the king, essentially, or the queen, made the religion. So long, again, there was a significant deference to the bishops, and to the point it basically became total deference to the bishops at one point. Whereas in France, the king, so long as he wants to remain Catholic, and so long as he wants France to be uniformly Catholic, under a sovereign monarchy has to go along with an orthodox iteration of Catholicism. Whether, again, that is correct or not from a political point of view, the argument is that the king, in terms of being able to exalt this Gallican conception of what it is to essentially have a church, is deliberately alienating French patriots and Gallicans and associating the monarchy with a church which is becoming all the more foreign, whilst at the same time causing a general degree of skepticism towards the sacraments and a war by figures like Voltaire against quote-unquote superstition. Once sacraments and miracles simply become superstition and medieval practices, then the very sort of basis of sincere, well-established religiosity in France is basically at an end. And again, this comes back to the question I raised in my introduction. Why, again, if we see the demise of a sacramental, sacred kingship in France, why did enlightened absolutism never take hold in France, the creator, essentially the home of its creator, Voltaire? And this is where I'm going to claim that Louis XV was a prisoner of the sacraments again, that to attack and even de-emphasize the sacraments was an attack on the king. But conversely, because the king was too conscious a Catholic and self-aware as a sinner, the king effectively destroyed the prospects of enlightened absolutism under the weight of his own sexual perversion, coupled with an intense religiosity and a religious self-awareness. And this is where I want to leave Van Kley and read a segment from Hippolyte Taine's The Ancien Régime. For reference, Hippolyte Taine is one of the great French historians, again, of the 19th century, and wrote his famous Origins of Contemporary France, and this is part of a series of books. But he attempted to summarize the monarchy in France and Louis XV's reign as follows. To properly understand the history of our kings, let the fundamental principle be always recognized that France is their territory, a farm transmitted from father to son, at first small, then slowly enlarged, and at last prodigiously enlarged, because the proprietor, always on the watch, has found means to make favorable additions at the expense of his neighbors. At the end of 800 years, it comprises about 27,000 leagues of territory. His interests and his self-love certainly harmonize at certain points with the public welfare. In the aggregate, he is not a poor administrator. Since he has always aggrandized himself, he has done better than many others. Moreover, around him, a number of expert individuals, old family councillors withdrawn from business and devoted to the domain, with good heads and grey beards, respectfully remonstrate with him. When he spends too freely, they often invest him in public improvements in roads, canals, hotels for invalids, military schools, scientific institutions, and charity workshops. In the limitations of mainmorts, in the toleration of heretics, and the postponement of monastic vows to the age of 21, in the provincial assemblies, and in other reforms by which the feudal domain becomes transformed into a modern domain. Nevertheless, the domain, feudal or modern times, remains his property, which he can abuse as well as use. Now, whoever use with full sway of ends, or by using with full license, if in his ordinary conduct personal motives do not prevail over public motives, he may be a saint, like Louis IX, a Stoic, like Marcus Aurelius, while remaining a seigneur, a man of the world, like the people of his court, yet more badly brought up, worse surrounded, more solicited, more tempted, and more blindfolded. At the very least, he has, like them, his own self-love, his own tests, his own kindred, his mistress, his wife, his friends, all intimate and influential solicitors, who must be satisfied, while the nation only comes after them. The result is that for 100 years, from 1672 to 1774, that being the death of Louis XV, and that being really the time of Louis XIV's great majority, whenever he makes war, it is through pique, through vanity, through family interest, through calculation of private advantages, or to gratify a woman. And to gratify a woman is with particular venom directed at the figure of Louis XV. In other words, we're talking about the great seigneur, the lord, the man who is so consummately identified the cause of France with himself to the point that they had become indivisible, and yet, from the point of view of Taine, so swayed and so again tempted by their surroundings to sin on a scale which again far exceeds that of ordinary men. In the case of Louis XV, the cause of the French monarchy becomes that of vanity, private advantage, and ultimately of lust and sexual gratification. And combine this to what has already been mentioned, which is the accusations of Louis XV's passivity. Frederick II, that being of Prussia, who rises at 4 o'clock in the morning, and Napoleon, who dictates half the night in his bath and who works 18 hours a day, would scarcely suffice for its needs. Such a regime cannot operate without constant strain, without indefatigable energy, without infallible discernment, without military rigidity, without superior genius. On those conditions alone can one convert 25 millions or 27 millions of men into automatons and substitute his own will, lucid throughout, coherent throughout, and everywhere present for the wills of those he abolishes. Louis XV lets the good machine work by itself, while he settles down into apathy. They would have it so, they thought it all for the best in his manner of speaking, when ministerial measures prove too unsuccessful. If I were a lieutenant of police, he would say again, I would prohibit cabs. In vain, he is aware of the machine being dislocated, for he can do nothing, and he causes nothing to be done. And part of, again, Van Kley's assessment confirms this. As early as 1724, so this is very early on into the reign, a police reporter noted that Parisians continued to talk about the dissipations, the plaisirs, and the limitations of this young monarch, of whom they foresee nothing good. At various points in roughly 20 years spanned by these police reports, the king was thought to have been a debaucher of men, a pastry maker, and a cheese maker, none of them very royal occupations, as well as an ungracious gamester, a reckless hunter, and a melancholic imbecile. When not distracted by these or other activities, none of them very royal. Well before the government's first experiment in freezing grain prices in the 1760s, Parisians suspected that they had a grain merchant for their king. Long before the children kidnapping riot of 1750, they suspected him of arranging for the kidnapping of children. But most of all, the king was thought to be lazy and irresponsible, given over to pleasures and the hunt, and incapable of asserting himself vis-a-vis Cardinal Fleury, that being his chief minister up until 1743, and other ministers to whom he had abnegated all governmental responsibility, although, as Thomas Kaiser points out, the young king's handlers tried to market him as Louis the Pacific. Parisians promptly renamed him Louis the Hunter. And although the hope persisted during this period that if Fleury ever died, the king would finally come into his own reign by himself, and make all things right, skeptics were never lacking to warn that the king is naturally stupid and timid, that it is natural for his majesty to follow the prejudices of his childhood and those suggested to him by his preceptor, the Cardinal Fleury. There is a certain amount of revisionism going this. So this is David Schalk and his view. And interestingly enough, it actually comes back and confirms the original view I brought up about the king essentially being a prisoner of his own intense religiosity combined with his own sin. Another element in Louis XV's character, which is hard to classify as a vice or virtue, is his lack of certainty. He did not possess the supreme arrogance and confidence which was ordinarily equated with his great-grandfather Louis XIV, but rather endured moments of self-doubt and anguish when he felt that he had been doing a disservice to his people and made extravagant promises to reform his libertine existence. The first of these periods occurred after the death of his mistress, Madame de Vanmille, in 1741. Again, in 1744, after a serious illness, he repented sincerely and made his peace with the church. But his resolution did not hold. In other words, the aspect of him conscious of his, you can say, limitations, the point he's willing to defer to ministers, the fact that he's aware of his libertine and licentious existence, and these various sort of outpourings of grief associated with, again, a desire to reform you can say in many ways, to die and to resurrect himself, always fails. And if anything, the intention to do so illustrates actually the scope of his failure. In his correspondence with the elder Julie de Fleury, Louis XV's Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Anton Louis Ruel, repeatedly referred to His Majesty's scruples for fear of infringing on ecclesiastical, that is, spiritual jurisdiction. It was the same religious scruples that in part prevented Louis XV from confessing and taking communion and being in a state to touch for Scrofula. Intermittent in the 1730s, Louis XV's lapses in touching of the king's disease became chronic from the 1740s until the end of his reign. The confessional sources of this inability were, of course, the king's adulterous liaisons, first with the three de Nesle sisters, next with one Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, later the Madame de Pompadour, Madame d'Étole, whom he elevated to the Marquisate of Pompadour in 1745, and then with a bewildering series of women of more modest social origins, culminating in Jeanne Bécu, the so-called Duchess du Barry, in the late 1760s and early 1770s. Louis XV himself apologetically explained his inability to Ferdinand of Parma in 1769. At my coronation, I acquired the gift of being able to be the instrument of God's grace for the curing of Scrofula, but for this I must be in a state of grace myself, and it had been some time since this had happened. As to why he was not in a state of grace, the Abbé de Bernis, Secretary of Foreign Affairs in 1758, explained in his memoirs that the king is religious. He has followed only the most severe counsels for his interior conduct, and has preferred to abstain from sacraments rather than profane them. What is curious that these severe counsels is that they did not come from Jansenists, but from the king's Jesuit confessors, successively de Linière, Sylvain Perecieux, and Philippe de Maret. Their penitential severity broke an unofficial attritional contract between the society and the French crown from the reign of the gallant Henry IV, or at least from that of Louis XIII and Richelieu's confrontation with Nicolas Casson as royal confessor. It's interesting again because the Jansenists very much argue for, you can say, the issue regarding confession when it comes to the repeating acts of venial sin, which amount to essentially to mortal sin, where in this case it is the semi-Pelagian, according to the Jansenist Jesuits, who are responsible essentially for imposing this strict, I'm not going to say rigidity, but this Augustinian sort of notion of the fall from the state of grace, essentially, that the king has exhibited, and that so long as the king is so far set from the state of grace, so he cannot enact this sacred quality of kingship, which, if anything, again, the irony being that a Catholic king who was aware of his own state of religious disillusion should, of course, in many ways be the architect for a certain aspect of dechristianization. The fact that the rigorous Desmarais went so far as to refuse absolution to both the king and the Marquise de Pompadour, so long she stayed at court, even though she had long ceased to be the king's mistress, may well have been a factor in Pompadour and the king's relative indifference in the fate of the Parliament's offensives against the Jesuits in the 1760s. Indeed, the Madame de Pompadour sort of ceased to be the king's official mistress in 1751, but as you can see, sort of continued on for another decade to hold a certain influence over the king. But even the mere association of de Pompadour and the king was enough, as far as his religious instructors and confessors were concerned, to demonize and perhaps scandalize the king. And perhaps, again, they are right if they're actually looking not so much, again, to God as much as they are looking to the public opinion of the Parisians, that so long as the king's mistress is there, the association and the damnation of reputation by association will continue. The transformation of Louis XV from the pacific king of the early 1720s, the beloved king during his brush with death at Metz in 1744, this being the height of the War of Austrian Succession, into the debauched despot of the 1770s, was a long time in the making, and certainly did not wait for the set-to-over refusal of sacraments to get underway. To the king's perceived laziness and taciturnity in the late 1720s and gratuitous cruelty and barbarity of the 1730s, the 1740s added debauchery of his adulterous relations with de Pompadour, hard on the petticoats of the de Nesle sisters, and the dishonour of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, concluding the War of England and Austria, especially the arrest and exile of the Stuart pretender Charles Edward in consequence of the treaty of the same year. What he's really referring to there, Van Kley, is that after the Battle of Fontenoy, which was won by his Generalissimo, the King's Generalissimo Maurice de Saxe, the French more or less occupied the Austrian Netherlands. And that would have basically completed a part of not just French foreign policy, but in particular the foreign policy of Louis XIV, and won for France great renown, great sort of power and renown. But nevertheless, France decided to surrender these territories to Austria under pressure for the English to relent. There has been an argument essentially that the blockade by the English on the French was so strenuous that the king had no choice, but I don't believe that, and a lot of historians don't believe that either, that the king and his swearing away of these forswearing of these territories that he won by war was an unforced error. And whatever, again, glory he had achieved at the Battle of Fontenoy, Napoleon, for instance, describes Fontenoy as the point in which the monarchy, the ancien regime, was able to sustain its existence through glory. But of course, that's Napoleon speaking, whose entire sort of career was defined by sort of winning battles in order to ensure political longevity. But add to this the idea that he was also surrendering Charles Edward, Bonnie Prince Charlie. In other words, he wasn't just surrendering the territories of Belgium back to the Austrians, which again, by all rights, according to opinion at that time, should have been an easy conquest, and one that would have done much to bolster the prestige and power of France. But he is also surrendering the righteous cause of the Jacobites, who were perceived as potentially bringing about the Catholic restoration in England as well. In other words, he has surrendered the cause of France's expansionist aims, and he has forsworn the Jacobite cause as well. All the more reason that this, again, very generous peace that he concluded was actually seen as a great act of national dishonor. How dare you arrogate to yourself the name of beloved, asked a scurrilous quatrain in 1749, after detailing some prophetic reasons for revising an epitaph of the king. If we loved you for a while, that is before we knew you were vile, it's better to abhor you that there are still some French, and if we see your statue rise, we will live to see its demise. By and by, a tyrant must die without even a single wench, which will prove to be very prophetic in terms of the French Revolution. Indeed, there is a saying which is very much associated with Louis XV, but like that apocryphal sort of quote with Lenin I mentioned regarding the whole notion of the philosophy of time, and there are days where years happen. One quote which is associated with Louis XV as much as with Madame de Pomp, with Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. For Louis XV, it's after us, the deluge. In other words, the biblical flood. If Louis XV did really say that, then it was basically an admission that everything his reign had accomplished was that of morally scandalizing and destroying and resigning the fate of monarchy when his grandson will effectively become King Louis XVI. Whether or not he said that, it does sort of indicate, perhaps on the one hand, a genuine sort of laissez-faire attitude about the fate of the monarchy, which would damn him further, or on the other hand, it could represent a genuine sense of religious, intense sort of religious self-disdain. If we're going to look at his aloofness and his taciturnity and apply a bit of armchair psychology, we can say that that's very much informed by a low opinion of the king himself, which by extension would mean that he himself was responsible for bringing about these calamities on France by sundering the French nation through his own vices. But I want to sort of focus on the figure of Madame de Pompadour and how she arrived in a position of such sort of strength and influence, and whether this reputation is really earned. Because we have to understand that what so much damns the opinion of Louis XV is, I've been trying to actually underscore a through line with him, which is that I believe him to be a seriously religious man, whilst also being a great and conscious sinner. And such is again the accusation of Madame de Pompadour, that with all this scandal, accusations, and libel directed at the monarchy, how are we essentially to discern truth from the propagation of rumor and post-revolutionary and revolutionary propaganda? And this is an article taken from Tess Lewis's Madame de Pompadour, Eminence without Honor. By the time the king returned victorious from Fontenoy and the old Princess de Conti, deep in debt, had been pressured into sponsoring the new Marquise, Madame de Pompadour was ready to run the gauntlet, and she did so flawlessly, that essentially being of the new royal mistress. Had Louis XV not been the height of his popularity, riding a wave of victories, this being the Battle of Fontenoy, his flagrant defiance of the court's hierarchy might have been more effectively opposed. But Louis XV's subjects were still willing to forgive him a great deal. This is the time where he was still known as the beloved. Madame de Pompadour worked hard to establish herself in those early years. She assiduously courted the royal family and made some headway with the Queen, who had resigned herself to the contempt previous favourites had shown her. The king's children, however, called her Maman Pouton, Mummy Whore, and tirelessly intrigued against her. Madame de Pompadour's sphere of influence was at first limited to staging and starring in plays for Louis, had a privileged few, organised expeditions to Louis's many chateaux and county estates, hosting intimate dinners for 20 at which the court's constricting formalities were relaxed to the point where the king himself brewed and served the coffee and encouraged his passion for building. All the while she was suffering from her fragile constitution, repeated miscarriages, the machinations of her enemies, and the effort to be unfailingly cheerful and radiant. Within 2 years, she had been quietly but firmly extended her domain. She played to Louis's weaknesses and compensated for them, making herself ever more indispensable in his public and private life. He willingly ceded many burdens of governing to her. All petitions were routed through her. She received diplomats, ambassadors, generals, and courtiers, great and small, at her morning toilet, dispensing and withholding favour, and passing favourable requests on to the king. All this, again, is to illustrate it's not enough that the king is seen as flaunting the whole precepts of absolutism, whereby everything he does is exhibiting the power of the state. And as Taine actually sort of brilliantly indicated, that this is the time for a king to transform his subjects into automatons in order to be the will of the nation, as Louis XIV essentially was. In the case of Louis XV, he becomes replaced by the engine, and the state basically supersedes him in all respects. But it's again the double ignominy of not only deferring to ministers and abandoning the tenets of absolutism, but deferring the business of state not only to a mistress, but a bourgeois mistress at the same time. Hence the allusion to flaunting the traditional hierarchy of the court and the exceptional circumstances essentially which allowed for someone like a Pompadour to insert herself at the height of French society. An interesting question. A Frenchman is not even allowed to keep a single mistress, unless I'm misinterpreting the issue. Well, for people who know their French history, they'll know that the whole role of the maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, was a long-established tradition, especially by the time of Francis I. During the reign of Louis XIV, the most famous mistress was Madame de Montespan. And of course, as is the tradition, the king fathers many illegitimate children, gives them various titles and state pensions. In the case of Louis XIV, however, one of his mistresses, Madame de Maintenon, actually inspires with him a great religious reform in the 1680s. Indeed, her religious director is none other than the later Archbishop of Cambrai, Francois de Fenelon, who is a figure I'm going to be talking about very soon. And so she actually becomes Louis XIV's morganatic wife. And whatever, you can say, ignominy was associated with the early, you can say, how am I going to describe it? The king's virility in his earlier reign, for which he was forgiven, because again, he was seen as victorious, was combined with a deep sort of religious sincerity that we see towards the end of his reign. And most people point to the ratification of unigenitus at the end and the Edict of Fontainebleau. Even people who are scurrilous towards the monarchy but devout Catholics like Hilaire Bloch will admit that Louis XIV push through all these Gallican reforms sincerely as a devoted Catholic. When it comes to Louis XV, it's a combination of factors. It's not necessarily the fact that he has mistresses, it's the number of mistresses, it's the social rank of the mistresses. Having sex with 3 sisters in particular was deliberately scandalous, but it's the combination of deference to the mistress in political affairs as well. All of this is just confirming for Louis XV this scandalous association with what, again, Frederick II would refer to as government by petticoatocracy. That and Madame de Pompadour was so, again, equated with getting France involved in the 7 Years' War, which proved so disastrous to France. All of these factors, as hopefully I pointed out, can demonstrate how a figure like Louis XIV was forgiven his, again, licentious virility, where in the case of Louis XV, he was not. The view of some mainstream historians, such as Colin Jones, is that once Madame de Pompadour's sexual relationship with the king ended, the Marquis continued to play the role in the king's sexual life through conniving in the secret supply of virginal girls for the royal pleasure. She was aware of the king's private brothel at the Parc aux Cerfs. Most biographers and historians now dismiss charges that she procured young women for him as malicious court gossip. Given the precarious nature of her position, she could hardly have insisted Louis curb his sexual gluttony. The most she could do was have an unofficial mistress dismissed if she became too powerful or disrespectful, a tactic which she resorted only rarely, and which for the most part consisted of threatening to retire one of her estates. In particular, Louis, again, is presenting a rather revisionist take in order to put Madame de Pompadour in a more quote-unquote objective light. When I was talking about Madame de Pompadour in my Ancien Regime stream, I was very clear in terms of emphasizing that the whole logic of the Parc aux Cerfs is that supplying Madame de Pompadour, helping to supply the king with virginal girls of no public standing, was actually a way of ensuring Madame de Pompadour's continued influence by the idea that unofficial mistresses wouldn't be in a position to thwart her if the king's sexual antics were satisfied by a endless onslaught, essentially, of no-name virgins from Paris, which a lot of people found rather disgusting as a tactic, but there is a certain logic to it. So again, a lot of historians are now sort of pushing back on this and saying that this was all essentially the creation of libel against Madame de Pompadour. But you can't deny, again, and this is very much my view, that there is a political logic for indulging in the king's sort of insatiable lust in this regard for her own ends. The ravishing 16-year-old Marie-Louise O'Murphy, who, like her 3 sisters, was offered by her mother to the highest bidder, for example, was banished from the Parc aux Cerfs when the Marquis heard that she had asked the king about his old flirt. Even Jones admits to the lack of hard evidence that Madame de Pompadour was a procuress, but only in aside 100 pages after an initial charge. On the other hand, the Duc de Richelieu not only procured several of Louis's mistresses, but advised them on how best to manipulate him. This again is a note, is that whilst we can all attribute the vices and connivance to a figure like Pompadour, many figures in the French court were spreading libelous commentary about one another. And there was actually, I hate to say this, but there was a mistress race for Louis XV. There was a desire in terms of being able to court favor for various notables around the king to procure him his mistress, with the idea that the mistress could effectively act as a vassal or an agent for whoever promotes her. If you again think about the logistics of sexual politics in the reign of Louis XV, all of this serves to confirm is that even if any of this is true, and a lot of it has been proven to be true, such again was enough to completely scandalize the monarchy, demonize it in the popular imagination, and indeed, if we do take this as true, fundamentally desacralize and dechristianize it. I mean, it's even worse, the fact that, we have a man who is a sincere believer, who knowingly sins and commits the sin again and again and again and reneges on every sort of, again, attempt to mend his ways following a great sort of outpouring of tragedy or whatever. But the fact that nothing intensifies his desires and his sexual gluttony towards the end, and how his smallpox is actually as a result of an encounter with a girl who has the disease at the Parc aux Cerfs. All again, it's just to confirm that once you take the Sun monarchy of Louis XIV, where the king, the state, all of this is summed up in the person, and then the person becomes so corrupted. Go back to that quote, which is commonly attributed to Louis XV: "After me, the deluge, the flood." But as you can probably tell, there is a lot of revisionism when it comes to this topic, especially if you add the angle of women's history. But I want to finish this off by talking about the quote-unquote poissonades, which are again these defamatory verses written about Madame de Pompadour. This one in particular, which was directed at her after being responsible for the quote-unquote reverse of alliances when she was seen as responsible for allying with Austria against Prussia in a war which France lost. The great lords base themselves, the financiers enrich themselves, all the poissons, the fish, are getting big. In other words, Madame de Pompadour, it is the reign of the scoundrels. A little bourgeoisie, raised to be a little slut, raise everything down to a level and makes the court a slum. So, what is, you can say, the moment of no return? Well, Van Kley has written an entire book about the Damiens affair, but I'm going to summarize it very shortly without referencing him. On the 5th of January 1757, Robert Francois Damiens stabbed the king with a penknife as he boarded his coach at Versailles. He was a domestic servant and was apparently inspired by the refusal of sacraments controversy, i.e. where Jansenists in particular and Protestants were denied the last rites and denied the right to be buried in consecrated ground, which, as I mentioned, caused so much strain in terms of the monarchy and the sacraments. As a attempted regicide, Damiens was sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. In an era already trending against quote-unquote medieval punishments, Damiens became a martyr to the radical opponents of the regime, a reminder of the tyrannicide against Henry III and the impetus for enlightened opinion to galvanize against quote-unquote cruel and unusual punishment. Beccaриa's famous treatise against the death penalty was published only a few years later. By contrast, if you look to his contemporary Elizabeth of Russia, she had the, again, rather novel proviso that she refused to put anyone to death during her reign, one that she actually kept, as she was Tsarina of Russia from 1740 up until 1762, 1763, around the same time of the Damiens affair. So the use of being hung, drawn, and quartered was one of these great causes célèbres against the practice in the 18th century, leading to many quote-unquote enlightened rulers such as Leopold and Joseph to abhor the practice, if not seek the full abolition of the death penalty in general. But you can say that whatever sympathy was cultivated for the king following the assassination attempt was actually in part undone by the horrific mode of the punishment. And when I mention the reminder of Henry III had been assassinated after he had essentially been complicit in the murder of Henry, Duke of Guise. So it wasn't simply, again, perceived by many as an act of attempted regicide, but an act of attempted tyrannicide, that to kill the king would essentially end the despotic tyranny in France, which many people were beginning to perceive and associate with the king. And again, what confirms this is that, as was mentioned in the previous instances regarding the death of the king's mistress, in 1757, the king commits again to a great religious reform, and it's followed by the definitive relapse. The king's relapse after the Damiens affair confirms essentially the king and all of his vices. After the death of Madame de Pompadour, the issue of petticoatocracy and the king being ruled by his mistress is exacerbated when she is followed by Madame de Pompadour. Whereas Madame Poisson, who later became the Marquise of Pompadour, was a bourgeoisie, Madame de Barry was a prostitute. She had worked as a courtesan before, again, being noticed and basically sold to the king as a potential sexual conquest before basically she established almost inexplicably a role as the king's official mistress, again, to the horror of much of the court in France at that time. What accompanied this was a censorship regime and the suppression of the Parlement. And both of these acts, because again, there was a campaign so much against censorship as there was in terms of defending the rights of parliaments as a means to mitigate the king's, again, perceived arbitrary powers. And so the insistence on censorship and the suppression of the parliaments by Juan de Maupeou, the king's chancellor, ensured basically the full and utter destruction of his reputation. Indeed, in 1760, one Jacob Nicolas Moreau of the Free Burgundy Parliament in Accession said this of Louis XV: "It is useless to object that the king should not plead against his subjects. For the last 10 years, the king has not pleaded, while from all quarters everybody pleads against him, and thus he has lost his case everywhere." In other words, the whole aspect of silence and the king's reliance on censorship and suppressing the bodies rather than making his case for them is basically ensuring that libel and scandalous rumor will win. And essentially the view of a lot of revisionist historians who look on the legacy of the French Revolution and call many of its beliefs into question would perhaps again concede that Louis XV was the author of his own demise in this respect. And here we sort of get to the point of counterfactual history, which is Louis XV obviously lived too long. There was a certain tragedy regarding the Holy Union or the devout faction in France, as I alluded to all the way back since really the Duke of Guise and the French Wars of Religion. There was a faction that was critiquing the monarchy for not being Catholic enough. And the most vocal opposition tended to fixate on the notion of absolute sovereignty vis-a-vis the Pope and on the policy that Richelieu and later Louis XIV would pursue against Catholic monarchs in Europe. In the case of the Holy Union, they would refashion themselves as the devout faction, and they would win the influence of many very prominent figures. I've already mentioned the Guise family, who were one of the most powerful families in France in the latter half of the 16th century. And then there was Mary de Medici, the wife of Henry IV and the mother of Louis XIII, who represented the devout faction in opposition to Cardinal Richelieu. Of course, Richelieu won. Then we have the Duke of Burgundy, who was the father of Louis XV. The assumption was essentially that after the Grand Dauphin, the son of Louis XIV, died, the Duke of Burgundy, under the influence of Madame de Maintenon's former spiritual director, Fénelon, would modify the monarchy to make it, again, less focused on Gallican absolutism and sovereignty, in order to make it, again, ostensibly more Catholic. And then he died in 1712, ensuring that his son would inherit. And then there was the case of Louis XV's wife, the Queen Mary Lesinska, and the quote-unquote Mesdames de France, Louis XV's daughters, all of which were devout Catholics, all of which tried to press the king to pursue a more, you can basically say, harmonious relationship in terms of concord with the church, and who all dramatically failed, and as has already been alluded to, were treated by contempt by the mistresses, and in turn treated them with contempt. And of course, this also applied to Louis Auguste, the Dauphin and the son of Louis XV, who died in 1765, who was again seen as one of these great figures who wanted to see a Catholic resurgence and modification of the Gallican system in France. So it's remarkable to see that in all of these instances, in particular the Duke of Guise and Louis Auguste, that a series of family tragedies should actually thwart the Holy Union, the Catholic cause at every turn. So, for example, if Louis XV had died in 1750 or 1745 after the Battle of Fontenoy, the history of France could have gone in a very different direction. Instead, because Louis XVI inherited in the year that he did, in 1774, the damage had already been done, and despite the fact, again, he was an earnest Catholic and believer, that in an era essentially which had long since abandoned any sincere Catholicism, was now seen as a major political detriment. And that, if anything, again, is part of the great tragedy of Louis XV, that Louis XVI's Catholicism would be seen to be a liability. And that, again, is why I point to the fact that in an era where the monarchy was less consciously Catholic, the enlightened despotic route of Josephism or Frederick II of Prussia, or even Catherine the Great in Russia, would have perhaps served the monarchy's longevity better. So coming to the ascent of Louis XVI, this is a short excerpt from Keith Michael Baker's The Thought of the Ascension of Louis XVI on the King's coronation in 1775. Tensions and ambiguities in the service itself, the coronation service, revealed ideological strains within the contemporary conception of the monarchy and reflected the institutional conflicts of the last years of the reign of Louis XV. A proposal by Turgot to modernize and secularize the coronation oaths, most particularly in a way that would respect the claims of Protestants for civil rights, was rejected by Louis XVI. Turgot, by the way, was the king's enlightened minister following on from the fall of de Maupeou. He was the one who basically instigated that the king bring back the Parlement, but that had the effect of bringing out more forces in opposition to the monarchy and opposition to the Catholic nature of the monarchy. And Louis XVI, as was often the case, was pressured by more sort of anti-clerical, quote-unquote, enlightened ministers, but ultimately relented and went back to a default position of Catholic orthodoxy. But when the service reached the stage of the royal oath to exterminate all heretics within the realm, the king apparently found it less embarrassing to mumble an unintelligible phrase. The fact that the king essentially, in all but omitted the traditional coronation oath to exterminate heretics within the realm, in other words, to maintain the Edict of Fontainebleau. In 1788, a year before the Revolution, Louis XVI would issue his Edict of Tolerance, granting relief to Protestants and Jews, and was registered through the Paris Parlement, essentially gaining their blessing. This was a further confirmation of the failure of the Gallican absolutist compromise 3 decades prior, that being when the Jesuits were suppressed, and when the king had basically given up in terms of enforcing unigenitus. It would not be enough to quench either the zeal for further toleration of non-Catholics or the desire to nationalize the church that we see with the civil constitution of the clergy and the seizing of monastic property as the goods of the realm. In other words, 1788 proved too late if the king wanted to turn in the direction of enlightened despotism, and everything about his character basically rebelled against that. And all of this essentially sets the stage for the triumph of the critique of the absolute monarchy during Louis XVI's later reign and during the French Revolution. My point of view has always been that absolutism in France and Gallicanism was, to use an American phrase, because it sounds worse in English, a band-aid solution, and by English I mean English, and a band-aid solution from the 1620s to 1774. Feudalism, as far as the French monarchy was concerned, had demonstrated a great failing in the fact that the nobles had gone largely over to support Protestantism and had waged, in many ways, a series of private wars against the monarchy, corralling all of the all of the nobles in France into Versailles, and allowing for Louis XIV to exhibit this icon of Apollonian monarchy, the sun and all of the nobles essentially as his planetary sort of bodies orbiting him, was a way of cementing the loyalty of the feudal class to the king. But it basically had the effect of undermining all of the noblesse oblige aspects of feudalism and isolating the king should he not be so vociferous in terms of pursuing his absolutist agenda in terms of ruling himself, which is why for Louis XV and Louis XVI, the absolute monarchy was a major detriment, not just to them as human beings in terms of isolating them and making them nothing more than creatures of a increasingly debauched cult culture, but by extension scandalizing France as well, as much as Louis XVI would try earnestly to reform the system. And as we see with the whole Gallican system and the whole notion of pursuing the reason of state and sovereignty at all costs, even if effectively means divinization of the king, it reveals again a fundamental contradiction between the peace of Christendom and the desires of aggrandizing and making France more powerful at any cost, as Louis XIV would basically definitely explain. And so what began in the wars of religion in the second half of the 16th century as a religious crisis began to see echoes of that similar crisis in the latter part of the 18th century. When you go to a lot of French revolutionary historiography, the emphasis is mainly on extra-religious factors. But I really want to focus on the sort of the Marxist cliche of religion as the opiate of the masses, because I think it actually, in this instance, indicates a nuance about the state of the Catholic Church and quote-unquote throne and altar in the 1760s. The term that's been used quite a lot is Baroque Catholicism, a Catholicism which is grand, conformist, and rather sort of opaque, and much of its sort of rituals and the meaning behind everything becomes obscured. To much of, you can say, Parisian and enlightened society in the 1770s, Catholicism was, despite being the state religion of France, appearing more and more, if not foreign, then antiquated, superstitious, and obsolete. And thus we have the whole denigration of throne and altar, in which case, as we see the whole adage, the king is France and to be French is to be Catholic, the throne and the altar, the religion and the king have become so intensely associated that in many ways the decline of religion also means the decline of the monarchy. As I mentioned, there was perhaps a route for the king to take out of this in terms of enlightened despotism, but for the many aforementioned reasons that never happened in France. So when Marx talks about religion as being the opiate of the masses, it would seem to have a certain resonance with a very particular group of people at a very particular time, which is this context around the 1770s and 80s, when religion is seen nothing more as an extension of the power of the French state. I say that with, of course, the proviso of saying that I would find Marxist analysis basically incorrect in almost any other application. But within this very confined, specific application, it would seem to have an element of truth from which can derive so much of the other criticisms directed at the Catholic Church in the later stages of Louis XV. What also is created as a result of the critiques of absolute monarchy is something which is far more broad and all-encompassing than simple religious dissent. It's the creation of society. Much of the focus on, again, the historiography is about the emergence of a class consciousness, and a class consciousness that's brought up in opposition to a perception of ostracism, because the nobility had more or less monopolized most of the grand sort of functions of state at that time. And what positions there were held by a process of venality, in other words, purchasing and inheriting positions. So that, of course, is some part sort of an aspect which sort of dominates discourse. But what is very interesting about this whole notion of society is that the discourse is less about critiquing, you can say, the nature of the Catholic religion and wanting it reformed, but it becomes fundamentally de-Christian in terms of its goals. It becomes, again, first the elimination of the monarchy in favor of popular sovereignty, and then it leads to de-Christianization itself. It goes back to this idea that among certain elements of, I don't know, the philosophers or the Illuminati or even the deists, that whatever religion and whatever sort of power structures the monarchy did represent, it was actually unnatural. It was a perversion of natural laws. There had to be a restoration to an idealized form of Franco-Gallia, something that preceded the absolute monarchy. In other words, as I sort of mentioned, the absolute monarchy in France is a band-aid solution. The perception of critics of the absolute monarchy went much further and began to basically label the entire history of monarchical France as an aberration, and one must return to a pure sort of Gaullist realization of sort of political sovereignty, which again was very much fantastical. It didn't really reflect reality, but that was basically the common assumption that we see. And within this context, Van Kley, among many of the people arguing for religious causes of the revolution, are very much revisionist. In particular, Van Kley's arguments focus to a greater extent on Jansenism and what he refers to as the century of unigenitus, which I focused on far less. But if there is an aspect of his century of unigenitus that I find most compelling, it is the association of the monarchy with the papacy in a way that informed so much of the hostility towards Louis XVI when he began opposing things in the French Revolution, like the civil constitution of the clergy, which basically declared that the clergy would become subordinated to the French constitutional state. And this, of course, leaves the question open as to whether an Anglican solution could have insulated the monarchy from these accusations of foreign interference, both from the papacy and, as we'll later see, with other foreign monarchs, which was exacerbated when we had the flight to Varennes and the declarations of Pillnitz and the Brunswick Manifesto. My contention will always be that religious and Gallican reformism informed so much of the attitudes of the lower clergy that there was a genuine zeal in terms of purifying the religion in France, but that in itself was not the determining factor of the revolution. Rather, many of these religious impulses had largely been subsumed into other impulses, in particular Rousseauian impulses about the return to the state of nature. Even if these essentially arise out of Gallicanism, there is the national community, the desire to replace the king with an older form of government. That essentially is the climate in which Rousseauianism arrives. So Dechristianization occurs in France in terms of its monarchy as a result of this absolute contradiction within Gallicanism, whose reason to exist was the ruthless pursuit of French power. And this whole notion of French power and glory as being integral to the absolutist settlement was violently quashed in the 7 Years' War. What remained was a debauched and despotic monarchy under Louis XV, and this indivisible association with the church in France and the monarchy effectively damned the church in France by association. This was not, by that I mean Louis XV's reign was not the primary cause of the desacralization of the monarchy, but it was a legacy like a corpse that was shackled to Louis XVI, while he meandered through the contradictions of Gallicanism, which essentially bled over, and Gallicanism's final association was that of national and not royal sovereignty that doomed the king. In the 16th century, radical Gallicanism trended towards Protestantism, and in the 18th century, it trended towards dechristianization. And now we still have that Gallican tradition, which emerges in Gaullism and the pursuit of French exceptionalism and the whole idea of grandeur and national sovereignty. Again, the legacy of Gallicanism and becoming detached from the monarchy being unable to hold and monopolize Gallicanism as an idea, is demonstrated by the whole basis, you can say, of the French Fifth Republic since de Gaulle. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. That is essentially to delineate the difference between the interior dechristianizing of the French monarchy on the eve of the French Revolution, as opposed to the radical manifestation of dechristianizing we see with the open physical attacks on the church and the attacks on priests and the attempts to establish counter churches and temples for a reason. I'll go through the super chats and answer any of your questions if you at me. Unoriginal username for £5. Thank you very much. Unable to watch live but cannot wait. Thank you for your amazing content, AM. God bless you and the chat. Well, thank you very much. Unoriginal username. JBDC7 for $5. Do you recommend Colin Jones, The Great Nation, on this period? Thought I heard you mention his name. Thanks always for your work. Yes, he's relatively decent in terms of someone who's actually alive, talking about these topics. You know, I've been dealing with some slightly older historiography, but no, he's written a lot on Madame de Pompadour and the French Revolution. So, you know, if you sort of want to broaden your history, he's done a lot of popular histories of France, so not too bad. Thank you for the super chat. BB3003 for $7 Canadian. Doesn't say anything, so thank you very much. Thank you. And as for the questions in the chat, I mean, I've answered quite a few of them as I've gone along. I don't see any more questions as of now. So all I can say is thank you everyone for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Good night.